Story 1. The Porridge Pot in the Medieval Kitchen. When you step into the dim interior of a medieval European home, the first thing you might notice is not the walls of wattle and daub, nor the small slit windows that barely allow in light, but the hearth. This hearth was not simply a place for warmth. It was the living center of the household, the anchor of daily life. And at the center of this hearth, suspended from a hook, balanced on stones, or nestled in the embers, was the pot. More often than not, the pot was filled with something resembling porridge. Porridge was not a single dish, but a family of meals born out of necessity, repetition, and the constraints of medieval agriculture. To modern eyes it might appear dull, a slow-boiled mixture of oats, barley, millet, or whatever grain could be afforded, stretched with water or milk when possible, and flavored if at all with scraps of vegetables, herbs, or animal fat. Yet this pot of porridge, stirred daily, was the baseline of survival. It was not a delicacy, but a constant presence. Let us pause on the pot itself, for it tells us nearly as much as the food it contained. In poorer households, clay pots were the norm. Fired at low temperatures, they were prone to cracking, yet they were indispensable. Some were globular with narrow mouths, others wider for easier stirring. In northern regions, soapstone pots carved rather than molded offered better resistance to heat, though they were heavy and costly. Metal pots, made of bronze or later of iron, were the prized possessions of wealthier families or communal kitchens. Archaeologists, when unearthing fragments of these vessels, often find traces of scorched residue still clinging to the inner surfaces, a physical reminder of centuries of cooking gruel over open flames. The act of cooking porridge was not glamorous. It required time, patience, and constant watchfulness. The fire had to be kept steady, the stirring constant, lest the mixture settle, burn, and render the entire day's meal bitter. A large ladle or wooden spoon, sometimes carved roughly from a single branch, was the cook's main tool. The smell of boiling grains, earthy, nutty, sometimes sour, would permeate the small interior, mixing with smoke from the fire, as chimneys were a luxury not every home could boast. Daily meals centered on this pot. Unlike modern kitchens with multiple dishes, medieval peasants usually relied on a single pot for most of their nourishment. A morning serving of thin porridge might be ladled out, leaving the remainder to thicken over the course of the day. By evening, the mixture could be dense, sometimes cut into slices, resembling something closer to bread than soup. If scraps of bacon, dried peas, or turnip greens were available, they found their way into the pot, transforming porridge into what was often called pottage. Yet the line between porridge and pottage was thin. Both relied on the same vessel, the same steady fire, and the same repetition of labor. To understand the porridge pot is to understand the rhythm of medieval life. Consider the agricultural year. In spring, fresh grains might be scarce, and so last year's stores would be eked out carefully, often sprouting or dusty from long storage. In summer, milk could be plentiful, giving porridge a rare richness. Autumn brought new harvests, fresh oats or barley ground into coarse meal. Winter, however, tested resilience. When supplies dwindled, porridge thinned dangerously close to water, its nourishment stretched thin. The porridge pot was therefore more than a kitchen tool, it was a ledger of survival. Every grain stirred into it represented hours of labor in the field, tithes to the local lord, or dues paid to the miller who ground the grain. A broken pot could be disastrous. Repairs were attempted with iron staples, but often the family had to rely on the local potter for replacement. Pots passed down through generations became almost heirlooms, not for beauty, but for endurance. In the wealthier households, porridge was not absent, but its role shifted. At noble tables, it might be enriched with almonds imported from the Mediterranean, sweetened with honey, or thickened with egg yolks. Such dishes, described in medieval cookbooks, bore little resemblance to the thin gruel of the peasant, yet they still relied on the same fundamental process of boiling grain in liquid until it softened. The difference was one of abundance. Yet across classes, one thing remained constant. The pot had to be tended. Fires could not be left untended in houses of timber and thatch. Women, who bore the primary responsibility for cooking, often tended these pots for hours, stirring, adjusting the fire, and ensuring that no food was wasted. Children might gather around, dipping crusts of bread into the mixture when allowed, learning through repetition that the pot was at once sustenance and discipline. The pot was also communal. In villages, communal ovens were used for baking bread, but the porridge pot remained a household affair, tying each family to its own hearth. However, at times of festival or feast, larger cauldrons were used to prepare pottage for many mouths. Chronicles describe massive feasts where cauldrons as wide as a man's outstretched arms were filled with grains, meat, and herbs, feeding dozens. At the other extreme, monasteries maintained strict routines, with porridge or pottage served at regular intervals, silent meals punctuated by the scrape of spoons against bowls. So central was the porridge pot that it appears in folklore. In many tales, enchanted pots bubble endlessly, producing porridge without ceasing. These were fantasies born of hunger, where the dream of an ever-full pot symbolized abundance and deliverance from want. Yet in daily life, the reality was far more precarious. A pot of porridge could symbolize survival, but never plenty. If you picture a medieval kitchen, you might be tempted to imagine roaring fires, laden tables, or golden roasts. But for most people, most of the time, what you would truly see and smell would be the slow, quiet bubbling of porridge. A pot darkened with soot, a spoon leaning against its rim, and a household sustained by what lay inside. And so we return to the hearth, dimly lit, smoky, and central. The porridge pot, unremarkable to modern eyes, was a cornerstone of medieval daily life. It was not a tool of extravagance, but of persistence. Every bubble that rose in that pot marked another moment in the long, repetitive story of survival. Yet as we reflect on this simple vessel, a question lingers. If this humble pot was so vital, how did its design and use change across centuries? And what does that evolution reveal about the societies that depended on it? The porridge pot, though humble, did not remain static throughout the medieval centuries. To trace its changes is to observe how societies adapted to shifting climates, new technologies, and evolving diets. In doing so, we see not only a history of cooking but also a record of trade, craftsmanship, and the unspoken labor of daily survival. From clay to metal. In the earliest medieval centuries, clay was the dominant material for pots across much of Europe. Archaeological digs reveal coarse earthenware vessels, often wheel-thrown, sometimes hand-built, their surfaces rough and their colors ranging from pale beige to dark, smoke-stained browns. Such pots were fragile, yet they served. Clay cracked under thermal stress, especially when set directly on open flames, but people persevered. To prolong life, pots were sometimes lined with slips of finer clay or covered with simple glazes, though these glazes could leach, particularly when mixed with acidic foods. By the 9th and 10th centuries, improvements in metallurgy expanded access to bronze and iron vessels. While prohibitively expensive for most peasants, small iron cauldrons began to appear in middling households and were a prized feature in noble kitchens. These pots were heavier, more durable, and resistant to fire. They left behind distinctive traces. Iron cauldrons with soot-blackened exteriors and hammered rivets still survive in collections today. The cost of such a pot could equal several weeks' wages, yet it was an investment less prone to breakage, less in need of constant replacement. Metal pots also transformed cooking technique. Clay encouraged slow, careful heating. Iron allowed for more vigorous boiling. The consistency of porridge shifted as cooks grew accustomed to firmer, more rapid cooking, creating meals that were less soupy and more substantial. The pot itself guided taste, texture, and habit. Regional variations. Across Europe, the porridge pot reflected regional differences. In the British Isles, oats dominated. Scottish traditions of oat-based porridge trace back centuries, with heavy, lidded pots designed to keep heat trapped while oats slowly swelled. In Scandinavia, Soapstone vessels endured much longer due to abundant local quarries, their gray surfaces resistant to cracking and capable of holding heat long after the fire burned low. In Central and Eastern Europe, millet and buckwheat were common grains, their porridge prepared in squat clay vessels with broad mouths, allowing for constant stirring. The wide pot encouraged evaporation, producing thicker consistencies. Farther south, in the Mediterranean, porridge shared space with other grain preparations, bulgur and polenta-like dishes cooked in pots that doubled for stews and soups. These regional distinctions were not merely about grain or flavor, they reflected deep cultural divides in diet and identity. To eat porridge in England was to eat oats, in Poland to eat millet, in Italy to eat maize much later. The pot anchored local foodways, carrying within it the agricultural map of Europe. The daily cycle. The role of the porridge pot also shifted depending on time of day and season. In many households, the first act of morning was to stoke embers from the previous night and set the pot back on the fire. Morning porridge was often thin, barely more than flavored water, intended simply to provide warmth and break the long night's fast. By midday, the pot might contain a more substantial mixture, thickened with peas, beans, or whatever vegetables were available. In the evening, after long hours of work in field or workshop, porridge might again be served, this time thickened, perhaps flavored with drippings of meat if fortune allowed. The cycle repeated endlessly, creating a rhythm not of variety but of endurance. Children were raised on porridge. Infants weaned from the breast were spoon-fed gruel, its consistency adjusted for tender stomachs. The elderly, whose teeth failed them, relied again on the same pot, now offering soft sustenance easy to swallow. Across all ages, porridge was the common denominator, linking life stages together in a steady line. Porridge in class. The pot, though ubiquitous, mirrored social division. For the poor, porridge was daily necessity. For the wealthy, it was a choice among many dishes. Noble households might use porridge as a base for experimentation, enriched with almonds, dates, saffron, or cinnamon spices arriving through long-distance trade. The medieval cookbook form of curry, compiled by the cooks of King Richard II of England, includes recipes for dishes resembling porridge but layered with luxury ingredients. This culinary divide illustrates a paradox. The same technique, boiling grain in liquid, crossed every social boundary, yet what went into the pot marked status. To eat oats with water was survival, to eat wheat with almond milk was refinement. The pot was both universal and divisive, drawing a line between those who merely endured and those who feasted. Tools of the hearth. The pot did not exist alone. It was part of a constellation of tools, tripods that held vessels above the flame, hooks and chains for suspending cauldrons, ladles and skimmers for stirring and serving. Some kitchens possessed iron trivets or grates, allowing multiple pots to cook at once. Wealthier kitchens even had adjustable pot hangers, ingenious ironwork, allowing cooks to raise or lower vessels to control heat. For most peasants, however, cooking was crude. A pot set among embers, turned and shifted as needed. Ash crept into food. The smell of smoke saturated clothes and hair. The labor of tending such a pot was repetitive but essential. Without constant watch, the day's meal could be ruined and waste was unthinkable. Beyond the kitchen. The porridge pot extended beyond the household. In monasteries, it was central to communal life. Benedictine rules emphasized modesty and discipline, and meals of porridge, beans, and vegetables reinforced this ethos. Large cauldrons, tended by lay brothers or kitchen staff, produced vast quantities at once. Silence at table meant the sound of boiling, ladling, and chewing filled the air. In hospitals and leprosaria, porridge was medicine. Easy to digest, soft to swallow, it was offered to the sick as nourishment. Records from medieval infirmaries mention porridge prepared with milk for weak patients, or barley gruel mixed with herbs as a tonic. The pot here was not merely sustenance but care. In military campaigns, the porridge pot became a symbol of endurance under duress. Armies on the march could not rely on elaborate meals. Grain was portable, and when boiled in water, it became filling fuel. Chroniclers note that soldiers subsisted for weeks on little more than thin porridge, flavored if possible with salted meat. To keep the pot boiling was to keep an army moving. Repair and reuse. No object in the medieval home was used without thought to longevity, and the porridge pot was no exception. Broken clay vessels were sometimes patched with lead or bound with iron clamps. Metal pots, when cracked, might be mended by traveling tinkers, craftsmen skilled at extending the life of cookware. The trade in pot repair was itself a small but vital economy, for to discard a pot casually was unthinkable. Such practices remind us that the pot was not disposable. Unlike modern cookware, easily replaced, each vessel represented investment and care. The marks of repair speak of resilience, of a determination to make do with what was at hand. A slow evolution. By the late medieval period, the porridge pot began to change again. Advances in pottery introduced better glazing techniques, reducing leaching and increasing durability. Iron pots became more widespread, though still far from universal. Regional styles flourished, some squat and round, others tall and narrow. Each design carried implications for how porridge was cooked, stirred, and served. Yet despite these changes, the fundamental role of the pot remained the same. It was still the heart of the kitchen, still filled daily, still the vessel that carried families through hunger and harvest alike. The story of the porridge pot in medieval kitchens is therefore not only about what people ate, but about how they lived, how they worked, and how they endured. It is about technology and poverty, labor and resilience. But one question remains unresolved. If the porridge pot was so central to daily life, how did it come to decline, giving way to new methods of cooking and new forms of food in the centuries that followed? If the porridge pot was once the nucleus of daily life, the object around which mealtimes and survival revolved, its gradual decline offers a quiet but powerful insight into how history moved forward. As Europe transitioned from the medieval to the early modern period, the porridge pot, still present, still serviceable, began to fade in its central importance. Its replacement was not dramatic. There was no single moment of obsolescence. But across kitchens, cities, and centuries, the slow transformation of diet, fuel, materials, and domestic rhythms pushed the once ubiquitous porridge pot into the shadows. Shifts in the diet. The most significant catalyst in the pot's decline was a gradual diversification of European diets. By the 15th and 16th centuries, increased trade, agricultural innovation, and urbanization began to alter what people ate and how they prepared it. With the Columbian Exchange after 1492, new crops, most notably maize, potatoes, and beans, entered European kitchens. These foods didn't eliminate grains like oats and barley, but they created alternatives. The once standard gruel made of locally grown cereal grains had to make space for other starchy meals. As baking technology improved and bread became more accessible across social classes, the reliance on porridge for calories and consistency declined. Bread was portable, less perishable, and symbolically elevated as a mark of civilization. While porridge remained a fallback food, especially in poor, rural communities, it lost its centrality in urban and elite diets. As bread rose, the bread and soup model of meals emerged. Stews and broths, distinct from porridge in consistency and preparation, began to dominate daily meals. This shift was partly due to the increasing availability of meat stock and improved access to vegetables, made possible by growing markets and more regular trade. Changing cooking techniques. The design of kitchens was also evolving. The open hearth was gradually replaced with built-in ranges and eventually cast iron stoves. These innovations came slowly, unevenly, and at first only to wealthier households, but they marked a decisive shift in how heat was managed and how food was cooked. The old method, hanging a pot above the fire or setting it directly in embers, was increasingly seen as inefficient, smoky, and dangerous. As cooking environments became cleaner and more controlled, cookware followed suit. Pots became more specialized. Where the porridge pot once handled nearly every kind of boiling, new tools now divided the labor. Saucepans for reduction, kettles for water, stew pots for meats. The all-purpose porridge vessel, once soot-stained and thick-rimmed, became outmoded. Metal, too, was becoming cheaper. As cast iron and later tin-lined copper became widespread, they brought new shapes and features: handles, lids, spouts that did not align with the traditional porridge pot. Clayware began to recede into rural and impoverished regions, preserved mostly through folk traditions. Decline of the porridge meal. Even more significant than the decline of the pot was the decline of porridge itself as a staple meal. In monasteries, which had long preserved porridge and pottage as staples of simplicity and discipline, reformations and secularizations led to the abandonment or transformation of culinary practices. Many monastic institutions were dissolved, their kitchens dismantled or repurposed. Their communal meals, quiet bowls of gruel, gave way to more varied diets. Among the peasantry, porridge persisted longer. In times of famine or crop failure, porridge remained the food of endurance. But in growing towns and cities, daily gruel was seen as a mark of poverty. By the 17th century, it was increasingly relegated to the young, the sick, and the old. New notions of cuisine, especially among the rising bourgeoisie, emphasized variety, seasoning, and multi-course meals. The simple, one-pot porridge, which had once united social classes in its universality, became a symbol of backwardness. Cookbooks of the early modern period reflect this shift. While porridge recipes still appear, they are typically flavored, enriched, or disguised under new names. Even language evolved. The term porridge in English became increasingly associated with prison food, hospitals, or institutions. In some regions, gruel took on negative connotations of punishment or deprivation. And yet porridge never fully disappeared. Regional resilience. In Scotland, for example, oat porridge remained a national staple well into the modern era. The traditional porridge drawer, a wooden box in which thick cooled porridge was stored and later sliced, was still in use in some homes into the early 20th century. In Eastern Europe, dishes like kasha retained cultural significance, bridging medieval traditions with modern national identity. In Finland, puro; in Wales, limru; in Germany, grütze. Each retained their place in the diet, even as cooking methods modernized. These dishes often evolved. Porridge that had once been made in rough, communal pots was now prepared in enameled saucepans on coal-fired stoves or gas burners. The pot itself might be gone, but the rhythm it taught, the slow boil, the watchful stirring, the quiet patience lingered. From object to artifact. As the porridge pot vanished from daily life, it found a new home in museums and archaeological sites. Excavations of medieval settlements often yield pot fragments, carbon-scored and grain-stained, providing tangible links to everyday life centuries ago. In rural cemeteries, pots have even been found placed with the dead, perhaps as symbols of domestic care or reminders of earthly sustenance. Historians, too, began to take note. The domestic sphere, long overlooked in favor of kings, battles, and borders, began to draw scholarly attention in the 20th century. The study of food history emerged, and with it came recognition of how vital the porridge pot had been, not for its glamour, but for its endurance. Today, historians recognize that while castles and cathedrals tell one kind of story, the porridge pot tells another, of countless lives sustained in quiet kitchens, of mothers and fathers scraping spoons along clay rims, of hunger avoided by one more ladleful. It is not a heroic story, but it is a profoundly human one. A modern echo. In recent years, interest in traditional foods has brought a subtle return of the porridge meal. Steel-cut oats, barley bowls and whole grain gruels are now fashionable in certain circles, often served with fruit, honey, and chia seeds, centuries-old ingredients now relabeled as superfoods. Artisan potters replicate medieval-style vessels for rustic effect. Blogs celebrate the slow food movement and the lost arts of soaking and simmering. These developments, though driven by modern sensibilities and nutritional trends, echo faintly the world of the medieval hearth. In the steaming bowl of a modern breakfast porridge, there lingers a ghost of the past. And while the pot itself may no longer hang over the fire, its memory survives in the repetitive rituals of cooking. The same clockwise stir, the same careful tasting, the same patient wait for grain to yield to water and time. Final reflections. The porridge pot story is not one of invention or revolution. It is a story of constancy, of how people endured through centuries of scarcity and routine. In that endurance lies its significance. For 1,000 years or more, across frozen winters and famines, plagues and wars, the porridge pot continued to bubble. It fed the young and the old, the farmer and the monk, the soldier and the serf. And perhaps this is what we forget when we study history through the lens of kings and cathedrals, that the most important histories are sometimes the quietest ones. The ones found in soot-stained pots, chipped at the rim, never named, never praised, but essential. So when we think of medieval life, we might pause not just on the grandeur or the violence, but on the slow, nourishing boil of the porridge pot, a vessel of survival, of care, and of continuity. But if we dig even deeper past the clay, past the ash, past the grain, could it be that the porridge pot tells us something not just about how people lived, but about what they valued when the grand ambitions of power and conquest gave way to the simple necessity of another quiet meal? Story 2. Bread, gruel, and survival in the lean months. Throughout the agricultural societies of medieval Europe, the seasons held power over every aspect of life. But no season was feared more than that silent interval between winter's end and the promise of harvest, a period known by many names, but often remembered simply as the hungry gap. This was the time when stored grains dwindled, root vegetables softened and sprouted, and the bread bins emptied too quickly. Meat, if it had ever been slaughtered for winter preservation, was long gone or spoiled. The milk cow may have not yet calved, and the hens, sensing the cold, offered only silence where eggs had once been laid. In this fragile space, usually between late February and early May, bread and gruel became not just meals, but lifelines. A fragile economy of calories. To live in a medieval village was to live by the harvest. Most European communities were based on a mixed subsistence model of small-scale grain cultivation, vegetable gardens, occasional meat, and trade for salt or tools. Granaries, cellars, and root pits were meticulously managed through winter. But even the best-managed store rarely stretched cleanly from one harvest to the next. And so, by March or April, anxiety built. Grains might be measured out by the handful. Moldy bread would be dried and scraped of its bloom. A single hard crust might be soaked in water and shared among children. Some families resorted to husk flour ground from the outer layers of the grain, less nutritious and more bitter. Others ground dried peas or acorns into rough meal. Bread, that simplest symbol of nourishment, became something harder, smaller, more precious. Loaves shrank. The crusts thickened. Flour was stretched with everything imaginable: ground bean husks, rye swept from the mill floor, even fine dustings of straw or bark in the worst cases. In such times, gruel took on renewed importance. Thin and nearly translucent, it was easy to prepare and could be extended infinitely. A spoonful of oats could make several bowls. Children often received little more than warm water with a hint of grain, a gesture of food, more than food itself. Bread as ration. The medieval diet was rigidly hierarchical. Bread was central, but its quality and availability depended on class. For nobility, white wheaten loaves were baked daily, light and fine. For the poor, Black bread, dark, dense, and often sour, was the norm. Rye and barley were common grains for these coarser loaves, though in the Hungry Gap even those became rare. Monasteries, often well supplied from tithes and donations, recorded in their ledgers the diminishing weights of bread distributed during spring. What had been a full loaf in January might become a third by April. Hospitals and almshouses followed similar patterns, adjusting their rations as stores declined. One monastery in northern France recorded in 1316 a particularly grim note: "Bread given at lauds to the sick shall be halved, beginning this week. Milk is gone." That year, following 2 consecutive poor harvests, bread riots broke out not in cities but at the gates of monastic kitchens. Even in wealthier households, stewards monitored flour stores and calculated down to the last peck of grain how much bread could be produced before new crops were sown and harvested. The survival gruel. In kitchens both grand and meager, gruel became the filler, the background noise of hunger. It was not designed to satisfy, it was designed to delay hunger long enough for the next day to arrive. Sometimes milk-based, sometimes simply water and oats, gruel could be flavored with leeks, garlic, or onions if any were on hand. More often it was plain. In wealthier households, cooks added beer or wine to gruel or sprinkled in spices. These additions, however, were unavailable to most people. A pot of water with 2 spoonfuls of barley was more typical. Gruel offered warmth, hydration, and a semblance of nutrition. Interestingly, medieval medical theory supported this practice. Based on Galenic medicine, gruel was believed to moisten the stomach and soothe the humors. Physicians recommended it for convalescents and the elderly. Some monasteries even preserved detailed recipes for barley gruel meant for the infirm, including instructions for straining out husks and flavoring with fennel or sweet root. But in the hungry months, this medicinal gruel was everyone's dinner. Collective strategies. Surviving the lean months was not merely a household struggle. Entire communities developed customs and rules to manage scarcity. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, grain watches were appointed villagers who guarded communal stores and enforced restrictions on grain usage. Markets adapted too. In cities, bread pricing was often fixed by law to prevent gouging. Bakers found guilty of shrinking loaves or cheating on flour weight were subject to fines or public shamming. Some were placed in wooden pillories with baskets of their loaves beside them, mocked by the hungry crowd. Churches and parishes maintained hunger funds, stocked in good years to provide emergency bread and gruel to the poor in bad ones. These efforts were rarely enough. In times of extreme hardship, theft rose: grain stolen from fields before it ripened, loaves taken from windows, or, more symbolically, whole sacks of flour robbed from the backs of donkeys en route to mills. Chroniclers often called this hunger crime a category unto itself. And always the Hungry Gap loomed. Even when it passed, it was not forgotten. Its memory shaped planting habits, religious rituals, and even fairy tale-y stories filled with magical bread and endless pots of porridge, eternal feasts promised only in dreams. Religious fast, real hunger. Ironically, the hungry months often overlapped with Lent, the Christian season of fasting and penitence. This convergence turned involuntary scarcity into something closer to ritualized deprivation. Church doctrine required abstention from meat, dairy, and eggs during Lent, meaning the simplest gruel and black bread became not just practical but religiously appropriate. The wealthy might find substitutions: almond milk, fish, and honeyed breads, but the poor merely continued their lean diets under the guise of piety. Sermons praised those who bore hunger with humility. In 1254, a bishop in Normandy gave a Lenten homily praising those who find Christ in their crust and their cup of thinnest broth. Hunger became a spiritual discipline, even if the hunger was not chosen. Yet in many places, Lent was not enforced harshly. Priests, knowing their congregants were already suffering, made allowances. Rural records show widespread dispensations, official permissions to consume meat or dairy if the alternative was starvation. The hungry gap turned religion into resilience, and resilience into quiet desperation. And so the porridge pot returned once again, not as a symbol of continuity but of urgency. Bread hardened, bowls thinned, and families sat close to the fire, waiting for the season to change. Every mouthful was counted. Every crust softened with water and split in two. But what happens when the lean months extend beyond their expected span? When the weather fails and the harvest never arrives? Hunger was never just seasonal in medieval Europe, it was cyclical, systemic, and at times catastrophic. While the hungry gap described the predictable scarcity between the end of stored winter food and the start of the new harvest, there were years, dark years, when the gap did not close. In such years, weather failed, crops withered or drowned, grain prices soared, and bread and gruel, already meager, became unreachable. What had once been hardship became disaster. These were the years of famine. The delicate balance of supply. Medieval agriculture operated with razor-thin margins. Most peasants worked small plots, producing just enough to feed their household and pay dues to lords, churches, or the crown. The slightest miscalculation, early frost, prolonged rain, late blight, pestilence could lead to crop failure. Grain yields were low by modern standards. In the 13th century, a good harvest might yield 4 to 5 grains harvested for every one sown, a ratio modern farmers would consider ruinous. After setting aside seed for the next year's planting, there was little surplus. Even with careful planning, many medieval communities lived one poor harvest away from famine, and sometimes that poor harvest became many. One of the worst examples unfolded in the early 14th century. The Great Famine of 1315-1317. In the spring of 1315, heavy rains fell across much of northern Europe. The downpours did not stop. They drowned fields, rotted seed in the ground, and turned roads into bogs. Grain failed to ripen. Hay for livestock molded in the field. Salt production, crucial for preserving meat, was disrupted. Cattle diseases spread. This was the beginning of the Great Famine, which would last in some form until 1317 and leave millions dead or debilitated. Chroniclers wrote of markets with no bread, of children sold for scraps, of travelers collapsing by the road. Some towns passed emergency laws forbidding bakers from hoarding flour. Others enforced price caps that were ignored out of desperation. The price of grain in England quadrupled in just a few months. In many villages, community ovens went cold not for lack of fuel, but for lack of dough. People turned to any edible plant they could find: nettles, docks, and the inner bark of trees. Gruel, when available, was diluted to the point of water. Parish records from parts of France and Germany show dramatic spikes in death tolls and burials during these years. More disturbingly, whispers of cannibalism emerged in several sources, not universally accepted by historians, but impossible to fully dismiss. Some chronicles mention travelers being attacked, bodies taken from graves, and families turning against their weakest. The porridge pot, once the centerpiece of humble survival, was in many homes simply empty. Institutional responses. Famine was not merely a natural disaster. It was also a crisis of infrastructure. Medieval Europe lacked efficient systems of food transport. Even if one region produced a decent harvest, getting that grain to affected areas was costly, slow, and often blocked by feudal tolls or warfare. Nonetheless, churches and monasteries played an essential role. They opened their cellars, distributed bread, and established emergency feeding stations. In London, the bishop's granaries were raided with his consent, their flour baked into loaves and handed out to the poor. Some lords cancelled rents, others did not. King Edward II of England attempted to intervene, issuing price controls and import orders, but with limited success. The machinery of governance was simply not suited for widespread relief. Roads were impassable, food spoiled in transit, and merchants, seeing opportunity, raised prices regardless of royal edicts. In many regions, famine bread appeared loaves made from acorns, pea husks, bean flour, or moss. Desperation made people innovative but not healthier. These substitute breads lacked nutrients, were hard to digest, and sometimes mildly toxic. Illness followed hunger. Weakened bodies succumbed to infections, especially among children. Gruel, too, was adapted. Instead of oats or barley, people used ground chestnuts, boiled thistles, or even starch from pounded roots. While better than nothing, these alternatives offered little sustenance. A full stomach did not mean nourishment. Cultural imprints of scarcity. Just as modern generations remember times of crisis, war, depression, pandemic, the medieval mind was scarred by famine. Popular songs, proverbs, and prayers reflected anxiety about empty bread bins and the silence of the cooking pot. Monastic scribes recorded marginalia in manuscripts. "Lord, send us rain, but not so much," or "let not the rats eat more than the monks." These were not jokes, but coping mechanisms, a way to maintain some emotional distance from devastation. The image of the broken pot, cracked and blackened, came to represent the loss of domestic stability. In some regions, it became a minor symbol of bad fortune, featured in folktales where families starve after the pot shatters. In others, the bottomless cauldron remained a dream symbol of divine mercy, an inverted echo of the emptiness they lived through. Paintings and manuscripts from the late 14th century sometimes show bread given to the poor as acts of penance or piety. The giver is depicted near the pot or hearth, linking generosity with the restoration of household plenty. And always the pot is there, not central, not ornate, but ever present. Rebuilding after hunger. When harvests returned, when fields finally dried, and grain once again filled barns, the trauma of famine did not evaporate. It left behind changes in behavior. Communities built larger granaries. Some monasteries invested in sturdier ovens, larger cauldrons, and new cooking technologies. Others organized rotating communal food banks, especially in areas where famine had been worst. On a personal level, many peasants and villagers became more risk-averse. They planted backup crops. They hoarded grain in secret pits. They married later, fearing the need to feed more mouths. These behavioral shifts would ripple for generations. But the cultural memory of famine remained. For decades after the Great Famine, records show people giving thanks not just for abundance, but for no rain, no rot, or a full loaf. These were not abstract blessings. They were tangible victories. The pot's quiet testimony. Historians and archaeologists today look for signs of famine not just in texts, but in the soil. Grain storage pits dug deeper, hearths left unused, children's bones showing signs of malnutrition. In homes excavated from the early 1300s, they find broken pots, buried hastily or thrown aside, unused. Some have burn marks high on the rim, suggesting that in their final days of use, they were set too close to the fire, hastily prepared, perhaps overboiled and ruined. These are small clues, but they speak volumes. In museums, one can find famine-era pots with repairs, stapled cracks, sealed holes preserved not for aesthetic reasons, but because the vessel was too valuable to discard. In the midst of hunger, even a leaky pot was worth mending. In one poignant find in modern-day Belgium, archaeologists uncovered a buried storage pot containing finely ground flour. Its mouth was sealed with clay. The flour was never used. The pot may have been hidden in a moment of panic and forgotten. Its contents were later determined to be mostly rye, mixed with dried peas. Was it a final reserve, held back in fear? Was its owner lost before they could retrieve it? In these small remnants, the broken rim, the burned bottom, the sealed lid we find traces of an age not of great battles or royal intrigues, but of silent meals and missing harvests. But if famine revealed the fragility of life in medieval Europe, what did survival teach? What strategies, customs, and stories arose from these brushings with starvation, and how did they shape the generations that followed? Famine, hunger, and the relentless pressure of the hungry months left more than empty bellies. They reshaped behavior, restructured communities, and rewrote the rules of survival. In the long aftermath of hardship, medieval society didn't simply recover, it adapted. To survive wasn't just to eat again, it was to remember how you endured. The return of bread. When harvests returned full and golden bread resumed its central place in daily life. But it was not the same bread. The experience of famine lingered in every loaf. Recipes were revised, storage improved, and distribution rethought. In many rural villages, communal ovens were rebuilt or expanded, sometimes supported by church or guild funding. These ovens became more than cooking places, they became centers of trust and cooperation. A good oven could bake dozens of loaves at once, reducing fuel costs and pooling risk. Families often took turns tending the fire or timing the baking. The ritual of marking loaves with initials or symbols scratched or stamped into the dough became widespread in this era, to prevent confusion when communal batches were baked. In some towns, bakers, guilds instituted emergency protocols. During shortages, they agreed to standardized weights and prices. In London, the assize of bread and ale regulated these values based on grain availability. While enforcement was inconsistent, the system itself marked a shift. Bread was no longer just food, but a governed commodity. Even in monastic rulebooks, changes were evident. Some abbeys, like Cluny, began keeping dual flour stores, one for daily use and one for emergencies. Others emphasized crop rotation and soil improvement, investing in better agricultural practices to avoid future scarcity. The physical act of baking, kneading, and shaping bread thus became a gesture of resilience. Each loaf was a quiet victory. Porridge as preservation. As bread returned to dominance, gruel and porridge never quite left. Instead, they evolved from emergency food to cultural fixture. They became associated with care, thrift, and humility. In many households, porridge was used to stretch leftovers. Bread crusts were soaked in milk or broth and simmered into a kind of slurry, sometimes sweetened with honey, sometimes salted and mixed with herbs. It was a meal for the elderly, the sick, or children, but also for anyone who understood that nothing should be wasted. In Poland and the Baltics, buckwheat and barley porridge gained prominence. In the British Isles, oats remained essential, often prepared overnight in thick pots and kept warm by the hearth until morning. In the Scandinavian north, cold porridge was stored in lidded drawers or clay crocks and sliced for days. This wasn't a step backward, it was a strategy of conservation. Porridge became a symbol of caution, of living with memory. You might have bread today, but you prepared porridge because you remembered when you didn't. Social strategies for lean times. Famine taught more than dietary lessons. It taught communities how to plan, store, and share. 1. Grain sharing and glebe fields. Many parishes began to set aside glebe land plots specifically reserved to grow grain for the church or for charitable distribution. After harvest, some villages conducted organized grain sharing events where surplus was redistributed among the poorest. While not always equal, these customs institutionalized compassion. 2. Dowries and marriage timing. Famine altered family life. Dowries shrank or were postponed, and marriages were delayed until better harvests guaranteed survival. In some regions, mass engagements were celebrated after the harvest, signaling both relief and hope. Local festivals, once purely religious, absorbed these new economic realities. 3. Religious endowments. Wealthier individuals, eager to secure salvation or public gratitude, began donating funds to create bread endowments. These provided for daily loaves to be given to the poor, often after Mass in some churches. This ritual continued for centuries, with famine altars or side chapels where food was distributed. For food as alms in memory. A funeral in post-famine Europe might include a gift of bread or porridge to the mourners or the poor. To feed someone was to bless their soul and to remember what hunger meant. Changing kitchens, changing mindsets. The kitchens of post-famine Europe looked much the same: open hearths, soot-stained walls, and battered pots. But the people within them had changed. Mothers taught daughters how to recognize spoilage, how to stretch flour, and how to forage wild herbs to flavor thin broth. Fathers instructed sons on the importance of crop rotation, timing the planting of legumes to replenish soil, or leaving land fallow to rest. These were not written lessons, but passed hand to hand, like the ladles and spoons carved from elm and ash. Some regions adopted new crops more eagerly, recognizing their resilience. In the South, chestnuts were ground into meal. In the North, rye and oats replaced more fragile wheats. Diversity in diet became a form of insurance. Even the layout of homes changed subtly. More households included storage alcoves or sealed jars, not just for the harvest but for the just-in-case. The emotional legacy of the pot. In the quiet moments of domestic life before the fire was lit, as the children slept, or when the fields were still, the pot remained. Not just any pot, but the porridge pot, the blackened one, perhaps cracked and mended, perhaps passed down from a grandmother who remembered the famine years. It was a thing of ritual. You stirred it clockwise, you never let it boil dry, you never left it unattended. Some families kept old pots even when they no longer used them. They hung them on walls or placed them near the hearth, not for use but as reminders. That pot, they'd say, fed us when the bread did not. Its presence was quiet testimony. We endured. In folktales, the porridge pot re-emerged not as a symbol of hunger, but of abundance, as in the familiar story of the magic pot that never stopped cooking. The twist in many versions, however, was cautionary. If you didn't know how to stop it, the porridge would flood the house. Even dreams of abundance bore the imprint of restraint. Final thoughts: survival as culture. To study medieval Europe through the lens of porridge and bread might seem unambitious. But it is here, in the bowls and loaves, that the essence of human resilience reveals itself. Survival wasn't grand or glamorous. It was tedious. It was measured in crusts and spoonfuls, in how long you could make a bag of flour last, in how carefully you stirred the pot so it didn't scorch. The hungry months were never entirely defeated. They were endured, season by season, generation by generation. And so the pot remained, on its hook or nestled in embers warmed by memory, seasoned with caution and filled with hope that, come next harvest, no one would go to bed hungry again. But if the porridge pot taught people how to endure, what did the tools around it, the ladle, the spoon, the knife, teach about the division of labor, of care, and of survival in medieval kitchens? Story 3: Ale and Oats Breakfast in the Monastery. In the world outside the cloister walls, morning was often noisy: cocks crowing, carts rumbling, hearths being stoked to life. But within the stone walls of a medieval monastery, morning began with something much quieter: bells and silence. For monks, the day was structured not by appetite or sunlight, but by the divine office, a cycle of prayers and readings that began long before the sun rose and continued until after it set. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and widely adopted throughout Europe, dictated not only when monks would pray, sleep, and work, but also what and when they would eat. And though many think of monks as fasting constantly, the truth is more practical. Monks ate daily, and while the meals were simple, they were structured with discipline. Among these meals, Breakfast, often a humble combination of oats, ale, or watered wine, was as significant as any sermon. To understand monastic life is to understand how even a spoonful of porridge and a cup of ale reflected theological precision, agricultural planning, and centuries of routine. The morning hours. Most Benedictine monasteries rose for matins or vigils in the darkest hours around 2:00 or 3:00 a.m. After this long service of psalms and readings, monks might return to their beds for a brief rest, or remain awake for lauds, the dawn prayer. Only after this, sometimes around 6:00 or 7:00 a.m., depending on the season, was the first meal of the day permitted. In many monasteries, this early meal was not yet breakfast in the modern sense. It was a collation, a small meal intended to sustain monks until the main meal, refectory dinner, served after the mid-morning office of terce or sext. But over time, especially in colder regions and during seasons of hard labor or illness, monasteries developed a routine of light breakfast, usually a thin oat porridge or barley gruel, served warm in individual bowls, sometimes with a crust of coarse bread or a cup of weak ale. This wasn't indulgence, it was prescribed sustenance, designed to support a body without distracting the soul. The food of penance and precision. The Benedictine rule cautioned against gluttony, but acknowledged the need for regular nourishment. It allowed for 2 meals a day under normal circumstances, but also left room for variation based on work, weather, and health. Monks were to eat moderately, and always in silence, listening instead to scripture read aloud by a designated monk known as the reader. Breakfast was thus not merely food, it was part of a ritual of quiet observation. Each monk, seated in order of seniority, would receive his portion from the kitchen bowl and take his place at the long refectory bench. The bowls were uniform, usually ceramic, sometimes wooden. The spoons were communal and often shared between meals. The oats or barley might have been grown within the monastery grounds, harvested by the same monks who now consumed them. Occasionally, other grains were used, spelt in Italy, rye in Germany, but oats were common for their hardiness and ease of storage. The gruel was thin, sometimes flavored with salt or a few chopped leeks or garlic if the infirmary cook had access to such things. It was not meant to be enjoyed, and yet, in its regularity, it brought stability. Ale, served in small earthenware jugs, was also standard, often very weak, what modern brewers would call small beer. This ale was safer than water and provided calories without violating monastic restraint. It was brewed on site in many monasteries, where the brewery was as important as the scriptorium or cloister garden. Brewing before sunrise. The presence of ale at breakfast may seem surprising today, but it was a key part of the monastic diet. Water was often unsafe. Wells could be tainted by runoff, rodents, or poor maintenance. Brewing removed impurities through boiling and fermentation, making ale a safer, more dependable drink. Monks perfected the art of brewing not just for themselves, but for visitors, pilgrims, and charity. Some monasteries became renowned for their ale, and the techniques developed in these quiet kitchens would later spread across Europe. Monastic ale served at breakfast was mild, cloudy, and often only slightly fermented. It was not designed for pleasure or intoxication. In fact, it often had more in common with broth than with beer. A single mug, often diluted with water, was sufficient for the early meal. Some monasteries substituted herbal infusions, depending on local practice. Nettle tea, meadowsweet, or thyme-infused water sometimes replaced ale, particularly in reformed orders like the Cistercians, who emphasized austerity. Yet even these herbal drinks reflected deep knowledge of plant life, digestion, and discipline. Each sip reinforced the monastic virtues of humility and simplicity. Breakfast for the sick and aged. Infirmaries within the monastery operated by a slightly different rhythm. Older monks, those recovering from illness, or novices still adjusting to the rigors of the rule were often allowed a more flexible routine. The infirmarian, usually a senior monk with basic knowledge of herbs and health, would oversee breakfast preparations for the sick. Here, gruel might be enriched with goat's milk or sweetened with honey. Occasionally, poached eggs or fresh cheese were served, still modest, but more substantial than the refectory fare. Infirmary breakfasts were not eaten in silence, nor always communally. Ailing monks could eat in their cells or in the infirmary's own dining space. These concessions reveal the humanity within the rule, which, while strict, acknowledged the needs of the body. Records from monastic kitchens show precise logs of ingredients used for infirmary breakfasts measured by the handful or the spoonful. These logs weren't just inventories. They were acts of accountability, proof that charity, care, and moderation were upheld, even in sickness. Hospitality and the morning meal. Monasteries also served guests and pilgrims, and their morning meals were another layer of the story. Travelers arriving late might be offered a bowl of warm gruel and bread before lauds. Pilgrims continuing their journey at dawn were often sent away with a scrap of bread and a cup of ale, a token meal, symbolic of Christian hospitality. The guest refectory, a separate dining space from the monks, was often supplied with the same porridge as the brothers received. It might be served by the guest master, a monk assigned to care for visitors. In this way, monastic breakfast became not just a routine, but a window into how the monastery saw itself as a place of discipline, yes, but also of care and quiet generosity. The sound of silence. The morning meal passed in near silence. The soundscape of the monastic breakfast was minimal: the scrape of spoons, the gentle clink of earthenware, the rustle of robes, the voice of the reader reciting from scripture or the lives of the saints. For many monks, this silence was not oppressive but comforting. It allowed space for reflection, for repetition, for the soothing regularity of sameness. There was no choice, no indulgence, no menu, just what had been prepared, shared, and received. This daily breakfast, so unremarkable on the surface, was an act of spiritual discipline, just as much as prayer or fasting. As the sun rose higher, and the monks moved from the refectory to the fields, gardens, libraries, or workshops, the warmth of that early bowl of oats and sip of ale remained within them, fuel not just for labor, but for contemplation. But how did this quiet breakfast evolve over centuries? And as reform movements swept through monastic life, how did these humble morning rituals change, disappear, or endure? The early morning meal of oats and ale, so quiet, so consistent, might seem immune to change. But as monasticism spread and fractured across Europe, even this simple tradition came under scrutiny. From Cluniac feasts to Cistercian austerity, the humble monastic breakfast became a subtle battleground between discipline and comfort, obedience and innovation, ritual and revision. Across centuries, the morning porridge pot did not disappear, it was redefined. The spread of the Benedictine model. By the 9th century, the rule of Saint Benedict had become the dominant framework for Western monastic life. Adopted widely in France, Italy, England, and Germany, the rule outlined a rigorous but practical model: communal living, fixed prayer times, manual labor, and modest meals. While Benedict himself had allowed for some flexibility, different regions and abbots interpreted the rule with varying levels of severity. As a result, the morning meal, gruel, bread, ale, took different forms depending on geography and climate. In warmer climates like southern Italy or Spain, monasteries might replace oats with barley or spelt, sometimes served cold. In colder northern regions, gruel was often thicker and cooked longer, providing warmth and bulk for monks who would soon labor in frozen fields. Some abbeys permitted small additions to the morning meal: a bit of cheese, a boiled root vegetable, or herbs from the cloister garden. Others, especially newer foundations, rejected these additions as creeping indulgence. These differences were not trivial. They reflected broader debates about what it meant to live a holy, disciplined life, and whether even the smallest comforts might lead the soul astray. The Cluniac approach, ritual over restraint. Founded in 910 in eastern France, the Cluniac order retained the rule of Saint Benedict but elevated ritual and aesthetics. Their monasteries became known for elaborate liturgies, rich architecture, and generous hospitality. In this context, the morning meal took on a different tone. While still simple by secular standards, breakfast in a Cluniac house was carefully prepared, often overseen by lay cooks and cellarers trained in the kitchen arts. Gruel might be served with milk from the monastery's herd, or sweetened with raisins. Ale was sometimes brewed with aromatic herbs like horehound or lavender. Records from Cluny Abbey in the 11th century describe warm barley broth, served to older monks during winter, with slices of toasted rye bread and small portions of dried apple or pear. These additions, though minor, marked a shift in attitude. Food was not only fuel, but a reflection of God's ordered beauty. Critics, however, saw this as the beginning of decay. The Cistercian reform returned to simplicity. In 1098, a group of monks left the Benedictine abbey of Molesme to found Cytox, sparking what would become the Cistercian reform movement. Their goal was to return to strict Benedictine principles, especially manual labor, silence, and austere living. The Cistercians rejected the elaborations of Cluny. Their architecture was plain, their music restrained, their meals minimal. In Cistercian houses, the morning meal was strictly functional. Gruel was made from whole oats or barley, rarely sifted or sweetened. Ale was served weak and in small quantities. There was little variation. Warmth and nourishment were the only priorities. In some Cistercian communities, breakfast was eliminated altogether during certain seasons. Monks would go from matins to work, breaking fast only at midday. When breakfast was offered, it was consumed quickly, often outdoors in the cloister, with no reader and minimal ceremony. Kitchen records from Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire list porridge, bread crusts, and small beer as the entire winter breakfast inventory. The emphasis was clear: restraint, repetition, obedience. The role of the cellarer and the kitchener. Two monastic offices shaped the morning meal: the cellarer and the kitchener. The cellarer, often considered the monastery's second in command after the abbot, managed all provisions. He kept track of grain stores, ale casks, dairy herds, and vegetable yields. A good cellarer had to balance charity with caution, distributing enough food without depleting reserves. The kitchener, sometimes also called the cook or refectorian, handled the preparation of meals. He supervised the timing of the gruel pot, the soaking of oats, the maintenance of spoons, and the refectory's cleanliness. Often, monks rotated through the kitchen as part of their work duty, so everyone learned how to make a proper pot of porridge. Instructions for the morning meal were detailed. In some monasteries, the gruel had to be stirred continuously for 3/4 of an hour to prevent burning. Bread crusts were inspected for mold. Ale was tasted before serving to detect spoilage. Monastic kitchens, far from being simple, were organized with military precision. Tools of the morning meal. The porridge pots used in monasteries were often larger and more durable than household vessels. In many kitchens, they were bronze or iron cauldrons, capable of feeding dozens. Some were suspended from beams over a central hearth. Others were placed on stone tripods or low grates. Wooden ladles, spoons, and bowls were common. Each monk typically had one spoon, kept in his cell or hung near his seat in the refectory. Losing or misplacing a spoon was considered an act of carelessness and might result in a penance. In some monasteries, breakfast was portioned into bowls labeled with initials to ensure fairness. Larger abbeys even had rotating serving carts, simple wooden frames, with handles used to distribute gruel quickly along long refectory tables. evolving understandings of health. As medical theories developed in the 12th and 13th centuries, monasteries began incorporating basic nutritional principles into meal planning. Influenced by Arabic and Greco-Roman texts, monastic infirmaries began viewing oats and ale as medicinal agents, especially for the stomach and liver. Grains were classified as warming foods, ideal for the early morning. Ale was seen as restorative, provided it was weak. Bread remained a neutral food, filling but spiritually inert. Some abbeys adopted seasonal gruel recipes, believing that different grains suited different humors: barley in summer, oats in winter. Salt was added sparingly, as it was associated with dryness and heat. These changes were minor, but they reveal a quiet shift. The monastic breakfast became not just ritual, but rational, an intersection of theology, medicine, and practicality. Small variations, deep meaning. Though the basic meal remained the same: gruel, bread, ale, the smallest differences mattered deeply. A slightly thicker porridge, a slice of toasted bread, a second ladle for the elderly, all of these choices spoke to a monastery's values. To give more than required was an act of generosity. To give less risked violating hospitality or care. To change too much might invite moral decay. Thus, the morning meal became a kind of spiritual thermometer, measuring the monastery's internal discipline. In time, reform gave way to flexibility. Orders changed, new communities emerged, and external pressures, economic, political, ecclesiastical, forced monasteries to adapt. But one question remains. In the centuries that followed the Reformation and the secularization of monastic lands, what happened to these traditions? Did the porridge pots go cold forever, or did they find a second life in schools, hospitals, and other places where routine and nourishment still walked hand in hand? Monasteries once dotted the landscape of medieval Europe, great stone institutions nestled in valleys, perched on hillsides, or tucked into forests. Within them, the quiet ritual of breakfast: oats and ale, bread and silence, played out each morning, almost unnoticed. But by the 16th century, the continuity of that world was ruptured. Reformation, dissolution, war, and political upheaval swept across the continent. Cloisters were emptied, monks dispersed, lands seized, and rituals abandoned or outlawed. But the monastic morning meal, that quiet act of communal endurance, did not vanish completely. It survived not as a relic of faith, but as a habit of nourishment and discipline, woven into the fabric of new institutions. The dissolution of the cloisters. In England, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VII between 1536 and 1541 marked the abrupt end of centuries of monastic life. Monks were expelled, libraries destroyed, lands absorbed into the crown or sold to nobles. What remained were often just ruined stone foundations and broken arches. Yet in the records of dissolution, the kitchens and granaries were often the first to be surveyed. Why? Because they held value: barrels of ale, stores of oats, livestock, and gruel pots. These were not merely religious items. They were practical assets, and many found their way into new uses. In places like Glastonbury, Furness, and Whitby, the kitchens and refectories were transformed sometimes into poorhouses, schools, or hospitals. And with them, the monastic meal structure persisted. Monastic habits in secular institutions. As Europe entered the early modern period, it needed new ways to care for the poor, the sick, and the young. And when secular authorities and Protestant communities began to organize charitable institutions, they often adopted the pragmatic routines of monasteries, including their meal structures. In workhouses, boarding schools, and almshouses, the day began with a bowl of porridge and a mug of weak ale or beer, just as it had in the cloister. The environment was different, but the logic was the same. Feed the body simply, uniformly, and economically. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Grammar schools in England and Scotland commonly served breakfast porridge. In orphanages across Europe, early meals resembled monastic collations: thin gruel, coarse bread, a drink of liquid sustenance. The spoon, the bowl, and the morning routine all echoed their older counterparts. Even the disciplinary tone remained. Meals were quiet, food was portioned by authority, gratitude, not choice, was expected. In this way, the monastic porridge pot became a kind of ghost, no longer sacred, but still governing the rhythms of care. The institutional porridge pot. By the 19th century, porridge had fully embedded itself into institutional modernity. It was the food of the hospital, the prison, the schoolroom, and the barracks. Military mess halls across Europe issued oats or barley for breakfast, mixed with water or skimmed milk, and eaten quickly before drills. In prisons, skilly, a thin gruel, became the staple morning meal, echoing the austere portions once served to monks during Lent. Hospitals, particularly in Britain and Scandinavia, prescribed oatmeal gruel to patients recovering from fever or surgery. Instructions for preparing it slowly simmered, lightly salted, stirred continuously, could have been lifted straight from a Cistercian kitchen. And in boarding schools, children rose at dawn to ladles of steaming porridge, often with no sugar or milk, sometimes shared from communal pots. The rationale was moral as well as nutritional: discipline, simplicity, and uniformity. It was, in many cases, a secular echo of monastic thinking. Survival in the folk memory. While institutions carried forward the porridge tradition in structured form, rural communities preserved it in folkways and memory. In parts of Scotland, Ireland, and northern England, the porridge drawer remained a household fixture. A wooden box lined with muslin or linen, it held thick-cooked oats poured in hot, left to cool and congeal, then sliced into portions throughout the day. Families passed down porridge rituals: which oats to use, how long to stir, which direction to stir in, always clockwise in some traditions, what herbs to add in winter, what spoon belonged to whom. Though the religious frame had faded, the sense of continuity, simplicity, and quiet care remained. The monastic influence on breakfast culture. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with industrialization in full force, breakfast was undergoing a transformation. Cereal companies, advertising campaigns, and changing work schedules reshaped the morning meal into something fast, sweet, and individual. Yet even in this new era, porridge survived in part because of its association with health and purity, ideals once cultivated in monasteries. Writers like John Ruskin and Thomas Carlyle praised porridge as a virtuous meal. Public schools in Britain maintained it as a mark of discipline and resilience. Reformers like Florence Nightingale recommended thin oatmeal gruel for hospitals, not just for nutrition, but for its emotional familiarity. Thus, the monastic bowl of oats and ale lived on not by name, but by structure. The spoon as symbol. In many monastic orders, monks were buried with a small wooden spoon, often the one they had used daily. It was not ornamental. It was practical, shaped by 100,000 quiet meals. In some traditions, the spoon was broken before burial, symbolizing the end of service. This small object, so easily overlooked, carried deep meaning. It represented obedience to routine, to silence, to the rule. It represented dependence on the community, on the land, on grace. And it represented humility, eating not what one wished, but what was needed. Even as monasteries crumbled, the metaphor of the spoon and the bowl endured. Final reflections: the persistence of quiet nourishment. The breakfast of the medieval monastery was never meant to be remembered. It was meant to sustain, to humble, to pass without remark. Yet its legacy is profound. It gave Europe a model for institutional care, for nutritional discipline, and for the ritual of shared meals. It demonstrated that even the most modest food, oats, water, ale, could shape identity and community. Today, we still begin our days with bowls and spoons, though we no longer listen to psalms while we eat, nor bow in silence before porridge. But the impulse remains, to start simply, to share, to care through routine. In the quiet ladle of oats into a warm bowl, perhaps we still echo the morning bell, the clink of ceramic on stone, and the hush of the refectory at dawn. And so we ask, if such modest meals left such lasting influence, what do our modern routines reveal about us? What nourishment, spiritual or otherwise, do we seek in the meals we take for granted? Story 4. Cooking for the peasantry: pots, hearths, and ashes. If you were to walk into a peasant's home in 13th century Europe, not a lord's manor nor a monk's cloister, but the rough timber house of a field-bound laborer, you would find few objects. A wooden bench, a rough-hewn table, perhaps a stool or two, a shared straw mattress, a roof patched with turf or thatch. But always, without fail, you would find a hearth, and beside it or above it a pot. The hearth was not only for warmth. It was the stove, the oven, the light source, the smoke vent, and the sacred center of the house. Meals were made beside it, bobbies born before it, and the dying sometimes warmed by it one last time. And in the peasant world, where food was neither abundant nor predictable, cooking was not a culinary act. It was a negotiation with scarcity. The methods were simple, the tools were few, and the meals, more often than not, were simmered slowly in ash-smeared pots, thick with grain and thin on flavor. Yet in these humble kitchens, Europe's culinary backbone was formed. A world without kitchens. It's important to remember that peasants did not have kitchens in the modern sense. The hearth was usually in the center of the single-room dwelling or set into the wall. Chimneys were rare until the late Middle Ages. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or didn't. Cooking happened in that same space where people ate, worked, slept, and sometimes kept livestock. In the poorest homes, chickens might scratch near the fire, and pigs could be kept just outside the door. The hearth was little more than a flat area of packed earth or stone, with firewood stacked to one side. There were no knobs, no timers, just fire, and the constant work of feeding and adjusting it. Above it, a suspended chain, iron hook, or wooden tripod might hold a pot. Alternatively, a stone ring in the coals would support the vessel directly. Ashes were moved carefully to create hot and cool zones. Everything was cooked in the pot, everything. The cooking pot, form and function. The pot itself, often the only cooking vessel in the house, was either ceramic or, in luckier homes, iron. It was blackened with use, chipped, often mended. Some had 3 stubby legs, allowing them to sit in embers. Others were rounded at the base, suspended from hooks to rock gently over the flame. Clay pots made locally were common but fragile. They couldn't be exposed to flame too quickly or they'd crack. Some peasants heated stones in the fire and dropped them into the pot to boil water without direct contact. Iron pots, when available, were prized. Durable and heavier, they could withstand flame and time. In some villages, a single iron cauldron might be shared among households, passed along for special occasions, or lent to neighbors in need. To own a sturdy pot was to hold a kind of domestic wealth. A pot meant the ability to feed, to boil water, to make nourishment from scraps. The daily meal, simmered, not served. Most peasants ate 1 to 2 meals per day, typically late morning and evening. These meals were almost always based around a grain-based porridge or pottage, simmered slowly with water, sometimes stretched over days. A handful of oats, barley, or rye was mixed with water and cooked slowly into a thick gruel. If a garden provided onions, leeks, or cabbage, these were chopped and added. If a bit of lard or bacon fat was available, it flavored the whole pot. In leaner times, nettles, dock leaves, or sorrel were thrown in. Meat was rare. Fish, eggs, or cheese were occasional. For protein, beans and peas were relied upon when in season or dried and stored. The pot was never fully emptied. The next day's meal was made from the last remnants, a cycle known in some traditions as perpetual stew. Each morning, more water was added, a few new ingredients dropped in, and the pot resumed its quiet bubble. It was an efficient method, nothing wasted, everything absorbed. Ashes and accidents. Cooking in such close proximity to open flames and embers required care. Accidents were common. Ash and soot found their way into the pot. Bread dough, when baked on flat stones near the fire, could burn on the outside and remain doughy inside. Children might knock over coals or fall into the hearth. Despite this, fire was treated with quiet reverence. It was rarely allowed to go out completely. Embers were banked at night, covered with ash to smolder until morning. To lose the fire meant needing a neighbor's help or flint, patience, and luck. Ashes were used purposefully. Some were scattered on the floor to absorb spills. Others were collected to make lye, which helped with soap making or cleaning cooking tools. The hearth was not just functional, it was a chemistry lab of the poor. Bread but not daily. Despite romanticized notions of daily bread, most peasants did not bake bread daily. It was too labor-intensive and required an oven, something few households had. Instead, villages often used communal ovens, operated on designated days. Households prepared dough and carried it to the oven, where a baker or oven keeper managed the fire and charged a fee or took a portion in return. The loaves were dense and coarse, made from rye, barley, or a mix of flours, often flavored with sourness from extended fermentation. Crusts were thick and sometimes inedible, but these loaves lasted for days or even weeks. Old bread was soaked in broth or gruel to soften it again. Sometimes bread was used as a utensil, a trencher on which pottage was poured, then eaten later when it had soaked up the juices. But in the hearth-centered world of the peasant, bread was supplementary. The pot was primary. Division of labor. Cooking was overwhelmingly the work of women, mothers, daughters, widows, and wives. From childhood, girls learned to manage the fire, tend the pot, portion food, and stretch the harvest across seasons. They learned to judge when porridge was thick enough, when barley was boiled through, when bitter herbs needed longer to soften. They developed a symphony of timing, when to add, when to stir, when to scrape. This was not romantic or leisurely work. It was unrelenting. There were no cookbooks, no recipes. Knowledge was lived and inherited. A mother's pot might be handed down to her daughter, along with the memory of every time it had boiled too long or too little. Cooking without choice. To cook as a peasant was to cook with what was available, not what was desired. The pot responded not to tastes, but to circumstance. A hailstorm could change the week's meals. A spoiled sack of grain might mean foraging nettles and boiling them with a bit of dried pea. A generous neighbor might offer a turnip, a stingy one might not. Even flavor was secondary. Salt was expensive and often reserved for curing meat. Spices were non-existent. The meals were bland, bitter, or sour flavors shaped by survival, not pleasure. And yet the pot remained. So what happens to a community that survives like this? Ash in the air, smoke in the eyes, hunger at the edges of every meal? What habits, beliefs, and rhythms emerge from this quiet, enduring relationship with the fire? Cooking for the medieval peasant was never just about preparing food. It was ritual, memory, season, and necessity, tangled together in a long, slow conversation with fire. Meals were made not from abundance, but from rhythm, the timing of seasons, the repetition of chores, the demands of dawn and dusk. The peasant didn't just cook because they were hungry. They cooked because the fire never stopped asking. The seasonal kitchen. The medieval peasant's kitchen was not static. It changed with the seasons, not just in what was cooked, but how. In spring, cooking relied on what little remained from winter. Turnips and carrots were soft and sprouting. Grains were low. New greens, nettles, wild garlic, sorrel were foraged to freshen the pot. In summer, the garden came alive. Cabbage, leeks, broad beans, and onions returned. Pottage grew greener. Dishes were lighter, sometimes eaten cold. More labor in the field meant quicker meals, often boiled before dawn and left to simmer until the workers returned. Autumn was the time of preservation: smoking, drying, salting, fermenting. Porridge might be flavored with dried mushrooms or apples. Barley stew thickened with squash or pumpkin. The pot was filled, boiled, divided, and stored. Winter brought simplicity: boiled grains, stored roots, salted meat if available. The fire was more than a convenience, it was survival itself. The pot stayed hot most of the day, not just for food but to keep the cold at bay. Even the texture of the pottage changed. Thin in spring, hearty in autumn, nearly tasteless in late winter. Each season had its flavor and every peasant knew it. The sound of boiling. In a house without clocks, the sound of the pot became a kind of timekeeper. A slow bubble in the morning meant chores were beginning. A sharper boil in the evening meant meals were near. A hiss or sputter could signal danger: a scorched bottom, a fire gone too high, or too little water left in the mix. Children were raised not just on the food from the pot, but on the sound and smell of it. A bowl of porridge was food, yes, but also memory. A reminder of mothers and grandmothers, of lean times and feasts, of burned hands and scoldings near the hearth. When a girl married, she often left home with a pot or a ladle, handed down with its own marks of history. When an old woman died, her pot might be buried, gifted, or broken ceremonially. Some regions even treated pots as symbolic vessels, not unlike how monasteries treated spoons. Cooking and community. Cooking was a solitary act but also a social one. Firewood had to be gathered communally. In many villages, communal baking days or shared ovens brought people together. News was exchanged near the fire. Recipes, as far as they existed, were shared by example, not instruction. In some places, multiple homes shared one hearth, especially in longhouses, where several families lived under one roof, their meals cooked in rotation or side by side. Festivals and saints' days often required larger meals. In these moments, peasants borrowed pots from one another or cooked in pairs, pooling resources. A rare feast stew might include dried sausage, butter, and fresh greens lavish by ordinary standards. These meals were eaten together, outdoors in summer or shoulder to shoulder indoors in winter. Everyone dipped bread into the pot, and no one complained about the taste. Sharing was part of the meal. Superstition and the hearth. The hearth was not just practical, it was mystical. Many cultures believed that the household spirit lived in or near the hearth, and that it must be respected. In Slavic regions, the domovoi was said to live behind the oven. In Western Europe, similar ideas persisted in subtler ways: unspoken customs of not cursing near the fire, or never letting the embers die completely, even in summer. To knock over a pot was bad luck. To break one was worse. In some villages, the ashes from the hearth were scattered on fields during planting season, to bring fertility, a reminder that the fire, the kitchen, and the earth were all one cycle. Herbs were sometimes hung over the hearth not just to dry, but to ward off illness. Garlic, rosemary, fennel, all believed to carry protective qualities. And on certain holy days, peasants lit special fires and let their cooking pots rest for a night, a rare moment of stillness. A language of scarcity. Peasant food had its own language. Meals were named not for their ingredients, but for their structure and setting. Potluck referred to whatever was in the pot: no planning, no choice. Poor man's stew was pottage made without meat or herbs. Ash broth was a thin, bitter soup often cooked in ashes directly or near an almost dead fire. Stir about was a thick porridge stirred constantly, often eaten standing at the fire. Even insults were culinary. To say someone was born with no salt meant they had bad luck or poor judgment. To call someone a cold spoon was to say they lacked spirit or warmth. Food shaped thought and cooking shaped metaphor. To cook badly was not just a practical failure, it was a social one. And to cook well, under such constraints, was an act of quiet wisdom and care. Children and the pot. From the age of 4 or 5, children began helping with cooking. Boys fetched water and firewood. Girls watched the pot, stirred it, and learned by doing. There were no written instructions, only stories and muscle memory. "Don't let it stick," a mother might say. "You'll smell it before you see it," a grandmother would warn. Meals were often eaten from shared bowls, with wooden spoons carved from local wood. A common tradition was to pass the ladle clockwise. To break this rhythm was, for some, thought to invite discord. And when food was short, children were fed first. Adults ate later or went without. A mother might pretend she'd already eaten. A father might add more water to the pot and say, "It's enough." These were the unwritten ethics of hunger. In all this, the ash, the silence, the endless stirring cooking was more than sustenance. It was culture, memory, and quiet resilience. Each pot of food was a reckoning, of labor, of time, of hope for tomorrow. But what happens when that quiet rhythm is broken? When war, weather, or wealth shift the balance and the peasant kitchen must adapt, resist, or perish? For centuries, the peasant kitchen followed a steady rhythm: harvest, simmer, preserve, repeat. But history does not stand still. From the 13th through the 16th centuries, that quiet domestic rhythm was increasingly interrupted by war, plague, climate shifts, and economic upheaval. And when life was disrupted, so was the hearth. The fire didn't go out all at once, but it flickered. The pot, once a symbol of routine and care, became a vessel of anxiety, adaptation, and sometimes desperation. Famine in the pot. Famine was not unfamiliar to medieval peasants, but from the late 13th century onwards, it became more frequent and more severe. Bad weather patterns, particularly during the Great Famine of 1315–1317, devastated crops across Europe. Livestock perished. Salt, needed for meat preservation, was washed from flooded mines. Grain prices quadrupled. In homes where meals were already modest, the pot held less and less. People began boiling inedible ingredients: bark, moss, dried leaves. Bread crusts were ground and recooked into bitter mush. Famine pottage, a thin liquid of whatever could be foraged, became widespread. Chronicles describe pots bubbling with ground bean pods, wild roots, even straw, not for flavor but for illusion. The appearance of food mattered, even if it no longer nourished. Hearths were still lit, but what they offered no longer sustained. Cooking became an act of ritual in the absence of substance. War at the doorstep. As if famine weren't enough, war intruded upon the hearth. Raiding armies stripped villages of grain, animals, and firewood. Soldiers commandeered homes, devoured stored food, or destroyed ovens to deny resources to their enemies. The Hundred Years' War, which raged across France from 1337 to 1453, was especially devastating. In affected regions, peasants buried their pots, literally hiding their cookware with their grain in forest pits or root cellars. Some dug clay-lined emergency hearths far from their homes, where small fires could be built in secret to boil food for children. Cooking became an act of stealth. Some families carried their cooking pots with them as they fled conflict zones. Iron pots became portable wealth, traded for shelter or protection. In some records, a pot was listed in a dowry or legal will, equal in value to a goat or a pair of shoes. And yet, in the ruins of burned villages, archaeologists still find the shards of clay pots, scorched and cracked, meals interrupted, homes lost, stories ended in fire. Plague and empty kitchens. The Black Death of the 1340s emptied more kitchens than any war. In the years following 1347, entire households were silenced. Fireplaces went cold, meals went uncooked, In some towns, one-third or more of the population perished. In villages, entire rows of homes were abandoned. There are haunting references in court rolls and wills to the pot left on the hearth. No one returned to stir it. In the aftermath, survivors were left with too much. Too much land, too many tools, too many pots. In some places, cooking vessels were discarded because new ones could be taken from the homes of the dead. It was a bitter kind of abundance. Shifting hearths, peasants on the move. Following the plague and recurring famines, many peasants became more mobile. Landowners, desperate for laborers, offered better terms. Some peasants abandoned their ancestral villages for better opportunities. With them they took cooking knowledge, seed stock, and their pots. In the 15th and 16th centuries, we begin to see more regional variation in peasant cooking, as ideas and practices spread. Recipes once limited to a valley or parish appeared in towns hundreds of miles away. This subtle shift in diet was often reflected in how the pot was used. Some began to roast more, fry more, use oils or fats from new crops. The pot became not just for pottage, but for new kinds of meals, sometimes influenced by city tastes, sometimes by necessity. Yet for many, the daily stew remained. Only the ingredients changed: more beans here, more cabbage there, a touch of pepper if a merchant passed through. The influence of trade and the market. By the late Middle Ages, markets were growing. Cities expanded. Trade routes brought new goods, dried fruits, spices, cheap iron cookware. For those who could afford it, meals diversified. Even among peasants, this slow shift trickled in. Some households acquired a second pot, often smaller, for boiling milk or heating water. A few bought metal skewers or griddles, broadening their technique. Ale brewing became more precise. Pottage remained, but it might now include a pinch of cinnamon or a handful of dried plum. These changes were modest, but they marked the dawn of a new culinary consciousness. Yet most peasants still relied on one pot, one fire, one meal, served at the end of the day. The hearth as symbol. Through all this, the hearth remained the emotional core of the home. Even when families moved, fled, or rebuilt, the first priority was always the fire. A new hearth meant a return to order. The pot, set on its hook, meant normalcy. The act of boiling grain meant, we are home again. In folklore, the hearth became the source of protection. A fire kept alive through a storm could bless a house. A pot left full for a traveler would bring favor. A girl who could stir the pottage without burning it was ready to marry. These weren't just tales. They were values passed through cooking. In the peasant home, wisdom was practical. How long to soak peas, how to save firewood, how to make a soup from bones and scraps. The pot wasn't just a vessel. It was a repository of knowledge, sacrifice, and stubborn resilience. The slow disappearance. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the shape of peasant cooking began to shift once again. Brick hearths with built-in ovens appeared in more homes. Cast iron pots became cheaper and more widely available. Chimneys replaced smoke holes. Cooking became cleaner, quicker, and more varied. Some households now used multiple vessels: a frying pan, a small kettle, even a baking dish. Bread became more frequent. Meals became a bit more complex. Still, the old pot hung near the hearth, used when needed, respected for what it had endured. Even as cookbooks began to circulate among the literate, the vast majority of people continued to cook as they always had. By feel, by firelight, by habit. Final reflections, ashes and memory. The peasant kitchen was never about grandeur. It was about endurance. From one generation to the next, the knowledge of how to stir, stretch, season, and survive was passed hand to hand. Not in words, but in repetition. The pot taught patience. The hearth taught humility. The meal taught gratitude. And in the long arc of history, those quiet kitchens kept the fire of European food culture alive, not in castles, not in courts, but in the smoke-filled corners of ash-warmed cottages, where soup simmered, spoons scraped, and families sat close against the cold. Today, few traces remain. The pots are in museums, the hearths are ruins, the recipes are forgotten. But the rhythm, the ritual, the act of cooking, not for taste, but for life, that still lingers quietly in how we heat a pan, how we share a meal, how we stir and wait and hope. And so we ask, if the peasant's pot tells a story of survival, what do our kitchens today say about how we live now and what we've chosen to forget? Story 5. The Market for Pots. Craft, Trade, and Guild Secrets. When we think of the medieval world, we often imagine kings, knights, and cathedrals. Rarely do we think of pots. Yet the simple cooking pot hanging over a fire, simmering stew, gruel, or porridge, was arguably the most important object in the daily life of nearly every person in Europe. And behind every pot was a network of craftsmen, traders, clay diggers, and guild members whose lives were built around shaping mud into necessity. In this section, we turn our attention away from the kitchens and into the workshops and marketplaces, where the humble pot was forged layer by layer, fire by fire. The invisible infrastructure. In any village or town, the presence of food implied the presence of a pot, and a pot required materials: clay, water, sand, firewood, and skill. The medieval potter was both artisan and survivalist. Unlike the carpenter or blacksmith, whose goods often served the elite, the potter's work was for everyone, from the wealthiest prior to the poorest peasant. Most communities had at least one local potter or traded with a nearby pottery center. Larger towns developed into production hubs, exporting their wares across regions. But pottery, unlike metal, broke easily. A single drop, a misstep on a stone floor, or a burst from fire could ruin it, and so the work was never finished. Pots had to be made constantly, which meant potters were always working. Clay, Earth's first ingredient. The first step in pottery was always the same: digging the clay. Not all soil would do. Potters searched for fine, plastic-rich clay, the kind that held its shape, didn't crack in drying, and could withstand fire. This often meant digging near rivers, hillsides, or exposed beds after heavy rain. In England, the Weald and areas around Staffordshire were rich in clay. In France, the Loire Valley. In Germany, areas near the Rhine. Clay was weathered, soaked, and kneaded, sometimes mixed with sand or crushed shell to prevent cracking during firing. This tempering process varied by region, and families often kept their own ratios secret, an early form of intellectual property. Some potters claimed that the best clay was dug during a waning moon, when the earth was at rest. Whether this was superstition or experience, we cannot say. But to the potter, clay was not just dirt, it was potential, responsibility, and risk. Tools of the trade. Most medieval potters worked with simple tools: wooden paddles, leather strips, blunt knives, wire for cutting, and most importantly, a wheel. The potter's wheel, typically turned by foot, allowed faster and more symmetrical work. However, not all pottery was wheel-thrown. Coiling and pinching, older methods, were still widely used, especially for larger or utilitarian pots like cauldrons or storage jars. In Northern Europe, kilns were often communal. These were dug into hillsides or built with stone, designed to reach high temperatures by feeding fire into a long flue. The firing process could take a full day, and any mistake, too much heat, too little air, could ruin days or weeks of work. Potters sometimes said the kiln had a mind of its own. The forms of daily life. Pots came in endless shapes, but most fell into familiar types. Cooking pots, often with rounded bases for open fire suspension. Cauldrons, larger, with legs or hanging hooks. Storage jars for grains, oils, or pickled vegetables. Ale jugs and pitchers. Porringers, shallow bowls for porridge or gruel. Chamber pots, though less glamorous, were in constant demand. Designs varied by region. In France, tall-necked jugs with thumb rests were common. In England, round-bodied cooking pots with loop handles. In Italy, wide-rimmed bowls with bright glazing. These were not decorative. They were designed for function, dictated by the heat of the fire and the shape of the meal. Yet even in their simplicity, some potters left marks. A thumbprint at the base, a family crest, or a small cross pressed near the rim, signatures of craft, not vanity. Markets and mobility. Once fired and cooled, the pots were ready for market. Pottery markets were common in towns, usually held weekly or monthly. Some potters set up stalls, others sold through middlemen, traveling merchants who bought in bulk and distributed wares to remote villages. The fragility of pots made transport risky. Merchants padded carts with hay, straw, or wool scraps, and even so, breakage was common. This is partly why pots were affordable. They had to be replaced often. Interestingly, some guilds required potters to stamp broken pieces before discarding them, to prevent others from reselling or repairing them fraudulently. These discarded shards, now unearthed by archaeologists, tell us much about medieval diets, trade routes, and cooking habits. Guilds and secrets. In many towns, especially by the 14th century, potters began to organize into guilds. Guilds were not simply trade unions, they were gatekeepers of knowledge. Membership required apprenticeship, often for 5-7 years, followed by a masterwork to prove one's skill. Pottery guilds guarded recipes for glazes, kiln construction methods, and clay sourcing locations. Secrets were passed verbally, and betrayal could mean expulsion or worse. Some guilds even regulated prices, ensuring no potter undersold another. This created a balance between profit and survival, especially in lean years. In cities like Norwich, Lyon, or Nuremberg, guild potters became respectable tradesmen, though never wealthy. In villages, they remained more humble craftsmen who worked for eggs, cheese, or coin. Yet across the spectrum, their role was constant. They made the objects that made cooking possible. The risk of the flame. For all their effort, potters lived with one truth: the fire might ruin everything. An unexpected gust, a crack in the kiln wall, a batch of clay too moist, these could cause the entire load to shatter or warp. A week's wages could disappear in smoke. Some potters developed rituals before firing: a whispered prayer, a token tossed into the flames, a pause before sealing the kiln door. These were not superstition, but a kind of emotional insurance, a way to face the unknown with some measure of grace. It's been said that every successful pot was a small miracle, and each one that reached a home, whether to simmer porridge, heat ale, or hold a meager stew, carried with it the mark of those who shaped the earth and endured its fire. In the next section, we'll explore how pottery traveled across regions and centuries, how local styles met foreign trade, how glazes changed the market, and how some pots became more than tools, they became cultural artifacts. But before that, how did pots reflect the social status of their owners? Were some pots made for pride as well as utility? And what happened when the pot was no longer used? Was it discarded, repurposed, or remembered? By the middle of the 14th century, pottery had transformed from a purely utilitarian craft into something increasingly diverse, mobile, and symbolic. While the basic cooking pot remained essential for daily life, other forms of ceramic production emerged, driven by advances in firing, the introduction of glazing, expanding trade routes, and shifting social structures. In this section, we explore how pottery became more than a tool. It became a marker of identity, economy, class, and even aesthetic taste. We move from muddy village kilns to bustling international markets, from coarse porridge bowls to the delicate, gleaming surfaces of salt-glazed stoneware. The rise of glazing, from function to beauty. Glazing, a method of coating pottery with a glassy layer to improve water resistance, was known since ancient times. But in medieval Europe, It began spreading significantly in the 13th and 14th centuries. Early glazes were lead-based, giving vessels a distinctive yellow, green, or brown tint. These were not always safe. Lead poisoning was a real risk, but they helped waterproof storage jars and added visual appeal. As techniques improved, potters learned to vary glaze components, apply colorants like copper or iron, and control kiln temperatures to create more sophisticated finishes. By the 15th century, regional styles emerged. In England, green glazed ware became common for pitchers and cooking vessels. In France, lead-glazed earthenware was produced with rich amber tones. In Italy, the techniques evolved into maiolica brilliant tin-glazed ceramics, with white surfaces painted in vibrant blues, yellows, and reds. Most peasants still cooked with unglazed or roughly glazed pots, but even in modest homes, a glazed bowl or pitcher became a status object often brought out on feast days or weddings. The pot as a social marker. Pots began to reflect the aspirations and social climbing of their owners. In wealthier rural households, especially yeoman farmers or prosperous artisans, glazed pottery served as a display of taste and respectability. Visitors might note a fine jug hanging on the wall or a painted dish brought out for guests. Wills and inventories from the late 1400s increasingly list pottery among household goods passed to heirs. For example, item, to my daughter Joan, the brown glazed pot with flowers and 2 pewter spoons. From the will of Alice Whitaker, 1491. In cities, apothecaries and merchants commissioned ceramic vessels bearing family crests, Latin inscriptions, or religious symbols. These pots were sometimes mass-produced in workshops, but carried the illusion of uniqueness. Early consumer branding. To own a pot that was more than necessary was to signal a life more than surviving. Export ware, crossing borders by cart and ship. By the 14th century, trade in ceramics was a growing industry. Certain towns became export powerhouses. One of the most notable was Siegburg in present-day Germany, where white-gray stoneware was made from high-quality clay and fired at extreme temperatures. These vessels were durable, elegant, and standardized, perfect for trade. Siegburg jugs, often with faces or coats of arms, were exported throughout northern Europe. So too were Raren and Westerwald wares, known for their salt-glazed finishes and decorative reliefs. These stonewares were sturdier than earthenware, making them ideal for shipping by river barge, horse cart, or merchant vessel. Ports such as London, Bruges, and Bordeaux saw ceramics arriving from Germany, Italy, Spain, and beyond. In return, English greenware and French jugs traveled in the opposite direction. Market records show bulk orders of 1,000 or more pots at a time, packed in straw or bundled in casks. The fragile became global, albeit slowly and at risk. Potters as regional brands. Certain pottery centers developed distinctive styles, allowing archaeologists today to identify the origin of broken shards by shape and color alone. Saintonge-ware, France, was easily recognized by its creamy white slip and bright green glaze. Pingstorf-ware, Germany, had striped decoration and tall neck profiles. London-ware used red clay and thumb-pressed decoration. Each type reflected local materials, techniques, and aesthetic traditions. These styles served as brands' early identities recognized across markets. To buy a Saintonge jug in Gascony or a Bellarmine bottle in Antwerp was to signal participation in a wider world. Though rarely signed, potters left marks: a stylized cross, a stamped rosette, a 3-dot triangle. These signatures, faint and coded, offered some trace of authorship in a world that prized anonymity. Guild conflicts and secrets protected. As pottery became more lucrative, guild tensions emerged. In cities, urban guilds often tried to restrict rural potters from selling within town walls, accusing them of using inferior clay, undercutting prices, or ignoring safety standards, especially with lead glaze. In response, some rural potters avoided cities altogether, preferring fairs and traveling markets. Others joined urban guilds, submitting to training, inspections, and fees in exchange for legal protection and broader sales access. The guilds fiercely protected recipes for glaze, kiln design, and firing sequences. Apprentices were sworn to secrecy, and families kept detailed knowledge within bloodlines. A successful glaze could make a pot shine like bronze, resist stains, or create dazzling patterns. But a misstep could ruin it all, turning a dozen jugs into toxic ornaments. Pots of pride, commemorative and ritual vessels. Some pots left the realm of cooking entirely. In wealthier households or among religious orders, special pots were commissioned to mark events, marriages, births, church dedications, or seasonal festivals. These commemorative pots were larger, often over a foot tall, inscribed with names, dates, or blessings, displayed, not used, often placed on shelves, or embedded into church architecture. Monasteries also used specialized vessels for holy oils, ritual washing, or almsgiving. These were often glazed in blue or white and bore Latin phrases or religious symbols. Even in folk traditions, wishing pots were made small, hollow vessels placed under floors, filled with coins, herbs, or prayers. In all these, the pot ceased to be a tool and became a symbol of memory, intention, and belief. The afterlife of a broken pot. Despite all care, pots broke. They shattered on stone floors, cracked from heat, or split from old age. What then? Mending was common. Metal staples, rivets, or even resin were used to hold valuable pots together. Repurposing occurred often. Broken pots became strainers, pans, or planters. Some pots were ground into grog, a tempering material added to new clay. Others became floor fill, foundation material, or were tossed into rivers, where archaeologists now find them by the thousands. The broken pot still served. It outlived its use but not its meaning. In fact, the majority of medieval pottery known today survives only in shards, millions of fragments cataloged, analyzed, and reconstructed into partial stories of vanished lives. Every chip tells of commerce, failure, preference, or pride. The pot as quiet history. By the 16th century, as Renaissance tastes spread and metal cookware became more accessible, ceramic pots began to lose their dominance in elite homes. Yet among the common folk, they endured. They remained unremarkable in life and treasured in excavation. Archaeologists rely heavily on pottery to date layers, map trade routes, and understand eating habits. In the silence of soil, pots speak. They do not shout, they do not boast, they hold memory in form and fracture. So we ask, if the pot was once both mirror and meal, what does it reflect when no one remembers who shaped it, who stirred it, or what it held? And what happens when the pot remains, but the story is gone? By the late medieval period and into the early modern era, the life of the humble pot began to shift once again. New materials, tastes, and technologies emerged that would slowly push traditional pottery to the margins of daily life. The world was changing, and with it, the place of the potter, the value of the pot, and the meaning of clay itself. In this final section, we trace the slow decline of the medieval potter's prominence, the evolution of ceramics into specialized art and commodity, and how the rediscovery of pottery fragments centuries later has helped us understand not just how people ate, but how they lived, failed, survived, and were forgotten. A new world, a new table. The 16th century brought profound changes to Europe. The age of exploration introduced new materials and foodstuff, spices from Asia, sugar from the Caribbean, maize and potatoes from the Americas. And with these came changes in dining and storage customs. More refined palates demanded refined vessels. Simultaneously, metal cookware, especially copper, pewter, and later tin, became more accessible. These offered greater durability, faster heat conduction, and, importantly, prestige. Even the rural aspiring classes began to acquire metal cooking tools, replacing older ceramic ones. By 1600, the once ubiquitous porridge pot was no longer the centerpiece of the fire. Potters responded in different ways. Some transitioned into producing tiles, pipes, and roofing materials. Others focused on decorative ware, tapping into the growing middle-class desire for beauty over function. Still others emigrated, especially to the New World, where clay remained both abundant and necessary. But many workshops simply disappeared. Their kilns crumbled, their secrets buried. The everyday pot was fading, the rural holdout. Yet the decline wasn't universal. In isolated rural areas, traditional pottery survived well into the 18th and 19th centuries. In some parts of Wales, Brittany, and Bavaria, potters continued making cooking vessels using methods virtually unchanged for 500 years. Clay was dug by hand, pots formed on slow-turning wheels, and kilns were still wood-fired. These were not artisans in the modern sense. They were survivors. Their work fed their families and fueled communities that remained tethered to seasonal rhythms and subsistence cooking. In many ways, their persistence helped preserve the legacy of medieval ceramic traditions that would have otherwise vanished. Some of these potters had no surnames, no signatures, and no records. Yet their pots now sit in museums under glass, labeled with centuries and styles that they never knew. The archaeologist's treasure, fragments of life. Modern archaeology owes much of its understanding of medieval Europe to broken pots. Because ceramic is virtually indestructible by natural decay, it survives where textiles rot, wood burns, and metal rusts. Shards, as they're called, can reveal trade routes based on style, clay origin, glaze. Diet through residue analysis. Social status, decorative elements, imported ware. Cultural shifts, sudden changes in form or materials. In sites as varied as London, Prague, rural Flanders, and southern Spain, pottery fragments help date entire layers of settlement. A shard of Raran ware, for instance, can pinpoint an occupation to the mid-16th century within a few decades. But beyond data, these fragments evoke something more intimate. A dropped bowl, a chipped jug, a discarded pot. Someone once carried it, cleaned it, stirred oats into it. Now it lies in a labeled box, filed by catalog number and century. Revival and reinterpretation. In the 19th century, the arts and crafts movement began to revive interest in traditional, handmade crafts, including pottery. Figures like Bernard Leach in Britain saw medieval pots as models of honest craftsmanship, simple, useful, and tied to place. This movement, though aesthetic in nature, sparked a slow reappreciation of what had once been considered mundane. Museums began collecting medieval pottery. Archaeologists began publishing typologies. Historians started paying attention to the rhythms of daily life, not just to kings and battles. In more recent years, experimental archaeologists have attempted to recreate medieval pottery using only period-appropriate methods: hand-dug clay, animal dung-fueled kilns, wheel-thrown forms without electricity. Their work has revealed just how much trial, error, and subtle skill was involved. It was not easy, it was not glamorous, but it was real. Pots as memory. What survives history? Often it's the extraordinary, monuments, manuscripts, weapons, but what shapes our lives quietly, consistently, is the ordinary. The medieval pot represents the heartbeat of daily survival. Every meal required it. Every household needed it. Every child watched a parent stir something inside of it. Its fragility ensured that it would break. Its necessity ensured it would be replaced. Yet in breaking, it left behind not silence but evidence. To hold a medieval pot fragment is to hold something once warmed by fire, crusted with porridge, and lifted by hands that no longer exist. The final fire. In some cases, medieval pots were intentionally buried or burned not as waste, but as ritual. In certain regions, pots were placed under new homes for protection or broken at funerals as symbols of life ending. To the potter, each piece was born of earth, shaped by water, transformed by fire, and destined to return to soil. It was, in many ways, a metaphor for the human body. So when a pot cracked in the kiln, it was not simply a failure. It was part of the cycle, a reminder that not all work endures, and not all tools survive. But the knowledge, the rhythm, the practice of shaping something useful from dirt and flame, that survives in museum cases, in reconstructed villages, in archaeologists' hands, and sometimes even in our own kitchens, in the quiet sound of a wooden spoon stirring stew in a ceramic bowl. A final reflection. The history of pots is not a history of objects. It is a history of necessity, continuity, and quiet labor. We may never know the names of the potters who shaped the thousands of shards unearthed today. We may never know whose hands poured oats into which bowl, or which jug served ale to a newlywed couple in a thatched cottage 7 centuries ago. But the legacy remains not in what these pots did, but in what they allowed humans to do: survive, gather, nourish, and begin again. What then will future archaeologists find in our kitchens? Will our plastic containers and factory ceramics say as much? Will they whisper our meals, our rhythms, our quiet days? Or will the humble, handmade pot remain the more eloquent witness of the human story? Story 6. Clay and Canon Law: the Church's quiet regulation of the humble pot. It is tempting to think of medieval Europe as a world divided neatly between the sacred and the profane, between soaring cathedrals and muddy huts, holy rituals and humble routines. But in practice, daily life and divine order were deeply entangled, and even the most ordinary object could cross that invisible boundary. The pot, so often forgotten in grand chronicles, was one of those rare tools that belonged to both worlds. From the kitchens of peasant families to the monasteries of Benedictine brothers, from the altars of village chapels to the rulebooks of ecclesiastical courts, the pot was both necessary and symbolically loaded. This story explores how the Church governed the use of clay, not just for liturgical vessels, but in the quiet regulations surrounding domestic cooking, fasting, sin, and sanctity. It is not a tale of grand heresies or famous bishops, but one of rules, routines, and the subtle weight of canon law upon the household fire. The pot in the parish. In the Middle Ages, the parish was the cornerstone of spiritual and social life. Every village had one, and its priest was often the only literate man in the community. The church was not simply a building. It was a presence, a moral authority woven into the fabric of daily living. This presence extended into the kitchen. Canon law: church law was not usually concerned with pots directly, but it cared very much about what was cooked in them, when, and by whom. On fasting days, which included every Friday, the 40 days of Lent, and numerous other holy days, the church forbade the eating of meat. This prohibition wasn't just spiritual, it had practical implications for the pot. It meant that families often kept separate pots, one for ordinary meals, which might include pork, beef, or lamb, and one reserved for fish, vegetables, or Lenten fare. Though not codified in the same way as later Jewish or Muslim dietary laws, this division was a quiet ecclesiastical standard, encouraged through sermons and confession. In some regions, priests instructed parishioners to scour their pots before Lent, lest any meat fat contaminate the purity of their fasting. It was, in a sense, an act of penance not just for the soul but for the clay. The rule of St. Benedict: pots behind monastery walls. If the parish shaped laypeople's lives, the monastery shaped the spiritual imagination of the age. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century but practiced for centuries afterward, governed nearly every aspect of monastic life, from when to wake up to how to eat. Though pots are not often mentioned directly, the rule's silence about them is revealing. The kitchen, dining area, refectory, and storerooms were places of strict order, humility, and control. Meals were simple, silent, and shared. Monks were discouraged from indulgence and gluttony. Meals were served communally, from large ceramic vessels, passed down the table or ladled out by assigned servers. The pots used were typically unmarked and uniform, in keeping with the ethos of humility. But not all pots were equal. In wealthier monasteries, especially Cistercian and Cluniac houses, finer pottery was sometimes reserved for the abbot or visiting dignitaries. This created tension, and some reformers pushed back, insisting that even abbots eat and drink from the same vessels as the humblest novices. In the 12th century, a Cistercian reformist wrote, "Let not the clay deceive us. No pot shall lift itself above another, for all are formed of the same dust." It was both theological and practical, an echo of Genesis, and a critique of ecclesiastical excess. Clay for Christ, sacred vessels, and liturgical use. The most explicit church engagement with pottery came in the form of liturgical vessels, those used in the Mass, for the Eucharist, for baptism, and other rites. Traditionally, chalices and patens were made of precious metals to honor the sanctity of the sacraments. But in smaller, poorer parishes, especially in remote areas, ceramic chalices were sometimes used. This was controversial. In the 13th century, Pope Innocent III issued a decree stating that only chalices made of gold, silver, or tin-lined pewter were appropriate for the Mass. Pottery, being porous and easily breakable, was deemed unworthy of divine contact, a vessel too humble for the blood of Christ. However, exceptions were made in mission territories and poor rural churches, where necessity trumped ideal. Some ceramic liturgical items have been recovered archaeologically, plain but carefully shaped, glazed inside and out, with stylized crosses scratched near the rim. They were used carefully, and likely with some anxiety, as clergy tried to balance piety with practicality. The pot, once a cooking vessel, was briefly transformed into a channel for the sacred, then quietly returned to the kitchen. Sins of the pot. Canon law also intersected with pottery in indirect, sometimes curious ways. For example, in cases of sexual misconduct, confessions sometimes revealed that lovers had met near the hearth, under the pretense of helping with cooking. In some inquisitorial documents, accused heretics were described as stewing strange herbs, a veiled accusation that they were making potions, poisons, or engaging in witchcraft. The kitchen pot, in these contexts, became a symbol of hidden danger, a place where secrets boiled and orthodoxy could be undermined. The line between cooking and sorcery, between sustenance and sin, was thin. To have a pot on the fire was ordinary, but to cook alone or in secret raised suspicion. Pilgrimage pots and holy water jars. In the later Middle Ages, pilgrimage became a major religious phenomenon. Pilgrims journeyed to shrines across Europe, Canterbury, Santiago, Cologne, seeking healing, forgiveness, or spiritual renewal. Along the way, they collected pilgrim badges and souvenir flasks, known as ampullae. These were small ceramic or lead containers, stamped with the image of a saint or shrine, and filled with holy water, blessed oil, or even dust from a sacred site. They were the medieval equivalent of a keepsake mug or commemorative plate, but with spiritual power. Ampullae were typically mass-produced by potters near pilgrimage sites. They featured crude images, St. James with a staff, the Virgin Mary with a halo, and were sometimes worn on a string or sewn into clothing. Though small, these pots were considered potent. To spill their contents was an accident. To break them intentionally was a sin. Their survival in burial sites and hoards suggests they were deeply treasured, long after the journey ended. The kitchen as confessional. Perhaps the most fascinating intersection of church and clay comes not from formal decrees or liturgical norms, but from confessional manuals. These were guidebooks for priests, offering advice on how to interrogate the soul and prescribe penance. Among their many questions were inquiries about cooking. Did the penitent break the fast by cooking meat? Did they prepare food during Mass instead of attending it? Did they waste food or indulge in excess? Did they cook on the Sabbath, a day meant for rest? To sin with the pot was rarely dramatic, but it was frequent and it mattered. The pot, then, was not only a vessel of nourishment, it was a mirror of the soul. What you cooked, when you cooked, and how you shared it could speak to your virtue or vice. A clean pot, used wisely, was a form of prayer. A scorched one neglected or misused might point to deeper disorder. Closing thoughts. In this quiet world of ecclesiastical regulation, the pot sat humbly at the edge, never fully sacred, never fully profane. It boiled soup on fast days, held porridge for monks, was washed in silence, and whispered over in confession. It was rarely the focus, yet always present. The church, in its grand cathedrals and Latin chants, may have seemed distant from the hearth, but in truth it hovered over it, shaping what entered the pot, what was poured out, and what lingered at the bottom. But how did the church handle moments when pots broke faith with doctrine? When clay shattered along lines of heresy, or when ceramic vessels became symbols of resistance rather than compliance? By the later Middle Ages, the Church's influence had woven itself deep into the structure of everyday life, but not without resistance. Beneath the smooth surface of orthodoxy, there were cracks, and pottery, humble, breakable, and ubiquitous, began to reveal more than just utility. As religious movements diverged from Roman orthodoxy, as reformers questioned wealth and ritual, and as ordinary people began to interpret sacred texts on their own terms, even the pot, the object least likely to cause scandal, found itself entangled in controversy and control. In this section, we explore the hidden meanings and political tensions surrounding pottery in late medieval religious life, from accusations of heresy to symbolic gestures of dissent, and the subtle power of clay in spiritual warfare. When clay becomes dangerous. In inquisitorial manuals and church court records from the 13th to 15th centuries, one occasionally stumbles across peculiar phrases. They boiled books with barley, or he smashed the blessed pot on the hearth. These are not metaphors. These were acts of symbolic defiance, and in the eyes of inquisitors, deeply suspect. In several notable heresy trials, especially those concerning Waldensians, Cathars, and later Lollards, the hearth became a place of unauthorized ritual. The Waldensians, emphasizing simplicity and direct access to Scripture, were accused of holding clandestine gatherings where food was shared, without blessing, in unclean vessels. Cathars, who rejected the material world and the sacraments of the Roman Church, are reported to have used special vessels in their own rituals made of unglazed clay, purposefully humble, to reject the ornate excesses of church-sanctioned liturgy. In Lollard circles in England, some sources mention deliberate use of common pots for sacred purposes, mocking the requirement that chalices be made of precious metals. The response was swift and often symbolic. Suspected households had their cooking pots smashed by church officials in gestures reminiscent of idol breaking. Destroying the vessel meant destroying the heresy it might have harbored. Pots as proof, inquisition, and material evidence. Most heresy trials were built on words: confessions, accusations, denunciations. But occasionally, objects were submitted as evidence, and among them ceramic vessels. In 1321, during the infamous leper scare in southern France, Officials raided homes and produced a list of confiscated items, including clay jars allegedly used to spread poison in wells, cooking pots used to prepare unclean brews, supposedly for mass poisoning, small ceramic flasks linked to supposed heretical rites. Whether these were ordinary household items or truly used for nefarious purposes is unclear. What mattered was that they could carry symbolic weight. They could be contaminated, not by germs, a concept still centuries away, but by spiritual corruption. Even in towns where no heresy was found, inquisitors sometimes ordered the destruction of all unmarked pottery used in shared meals, lest they become vessels of error. The clay pot, once a neutral object, had become a potential accomplice to theological crime. Ritual purity and ceramic boundaries. One of the ways the Church sought to maintain its control over daily religious life was through ritual purity. And while the Old Testament prohibitions of the Levitical codes were not strictly adopted by Christian canon law, the idea that certain vessels could be clean or unclean persisted. This idea was most evident in how churches handled excommunication. Excommunicated individuals were to be excluded from the sacraments, prayers, and even meals of the faithful. In some diocesan statutes, it is recorded that those under excommunication were not to be allowed to eat from the same pot as others. In one case from 1384 in the Diocese of Worms, a priest ordered that a woman accused of harboring heretical texts be given her food in a separate clay bowl, which was to be broken after use. This act reflected both theological anxiety and a kind of material scapegoating. If the vessel could be tainted by sin, it could also be destroyed to remove that sin. In doing so, the Church reaffirmed the boundary not just between right and wrong, but between what could and could not contain the sacred. The glazed divide, symbolism in color and finish. By the 14th century, pottery production had advanced significantly. Glazing techniques were improving, and colored decoration was more common. Yet within church spaces, plainness remained a virtue. Monastic orders such as the Cistercians prohibited the use of brightly glazed or decorated pottery in their refectories. This was not just about aesthetics, it was about discipline. A brightly colored pot might suggest worldliness, vanity, or worse, an attempt to elevate the mundane. In contrast, the common people often preferred pots with green or yellow glaze. They were easier to clean, slightly more durable, and perhaps most importantly, they looked nice. In sermons from the later medieval period, some preachers condemned painted pots as a sign of pride. One Franciscan friar warned his listeners, "Beware the shining bowl, for it may contain vanity more than victual." There was, quite literally, a divide between the pot for the poor and the pot for the pious, and yet these lines were blurry. A devout layperson with a green-glazed bowl might feel guilt for displaying it too prominently. A priest might favor a plain vessel, not from preference but fear of judgment. The clay was the same, but the meaning had changed. Eucharistic controversies and the clay question. In the high medieval period, one of the most significant theological debates was over the nature of the Eucharist, the doctrine of transubstantiation. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, formally declared that during the Mass, the bread and wine were transformed into the actual body and blood of Christ. This raised numerous practical questions, including what to do if the consecrated wine spilled. If it fell into a metal chalice, it could be wiped clean. But what if it had been poured into a ceramic cup porous, unsealed? Canonists argued fiercely over this. One school of thought held that any vessel not made of noble material risked absorbing the blood of Christ, making it impossible to recover and thus sacrilegious. This sparked edicts in some dioceses forbidding the use of ceramic chalices altogether, reiterating what Rome had long declared. But in poor parishes, The reality of economics meant that clay remained in use, unofficially. Some priests, unable to afford silverware, began to line ceramic cups with beeswax to prevent absorption. It was a delicate compromise, practical, but frowned upon. The pot had become a theological battleground, its pores a threat to the mysteries of salvation. Breaking the pot, a gesture of finality. In many parts of medieval Europe, a peculiar tradition emerged. When a clay pot broke, it was not simply discarded. It was sometimes ritually broken further, shattered into fine pieces and buried outside the home. This tradition, found in records from northern Italy, parts of France and Bohemia, may have had pre-Christian roots, but was absorbed into Christian custom. Some clergy encouraged the breaking of certain vessels used during times of sin, illness, or excommunication. The act of breaking was seen as a purification, akin to confession. The pot, unable to repent, had to be destroyed. In some rural churches on Ash Wednesday, broken pottery was gathered and crushed, mingled with ash, and used to mark the foreheads of penitents. It was a gesture rich in symbolism. Ashes from the fire, clay from the earth, a reminder of mortality. Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return, and so shall your pot. A quiet resistance. Not all symbolic pottery was condemned. In some corners of medieval Europe, pottery became a form of quiet religious resistance. In Bohemia, during the Hussite movement, simple earthen chalices were used to emphasize the right of the laity to receive communion in both kinds, bread and wine, a direct challenge to Roman Catholic practice, which reserved the wine for priests. These clay chalices became political emblems painted with slogans, distributed in secret, and passed among reformist congregations. To drink from a clay chalice was to make a statement that holiness did not require gold, and that the body of Christ could dwell in earth-formed vessels. It was not just a theological point, it was a declaration of equality. The church responded with excommunications, and where resistance turned militant, even war. Concluding thoughts. By the close of the 15th century, Europe was on the cusp of transformation. Printing presses would soon multiply texts. Reformers would openly challenge Rome. And in kitchens and churches alike, the humble pot continued to witness quiet dramas of belief, power, and resistance. What had once been a tool for boiling gruel had become a vessel of contention. It could carry heresy. It could carry holiness. It could carry fear. In the next section, we will see what happened to these clay traditions as the Reformation fractured Europe, and how ceramic vessels became part of a deeper cultural shift toward individuality, domestic piety, and eventually, modern secular life. But one question remains. If even the simplest clay bowl could be declared impure, blessed, or heretical, then what truly determines the sacredness of a thing? Its material or its meaning? By the early 16th century, the pot's place in European society, quietly significant for centuries, was about to shift once more. And not by a decree or an edict, but by the thunderous impact of the Reformation. What began with Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 was not just a theological revolution, it was a profound transformation of everyday religious life, especially within the home. Suddenly, altars and chalices were not just the business of priests. Now, ordinary men and women, potters, bakers, farmers, housewives, found themselves at the heart of the debate. The result was a reshaping of how people viewed ritual, sacredness, and domestic tools. In this final section, we examine how the humble pot became both a symbol and a casualty of these dramatic changes. Clay in the Age of Reform. Martin Luther, a former Augustinian monk, had no illusions about the grandeur of the church's rituals. He sought a simpler Christianity, one based on scripture, faith, and direct relationship with God. In doing so, he opened the door for a reconsideration of nearly every practice and object associated with the Catholic tradition. That included the pot. Reformers criticized the Church's insistence on precious materials for sacred rites. They pointed to Scripture. "We have this treasure in earthen vessels," 2 Corinthians 4:7, arguing that the holiness of the Eucharist or prayer did not depend on silver or gold. In many Lutheran and Calvinist communities, particularly in the German states and the Netherlands, simple unglazed earthenware began to appear in churches. This was not a regression, but a statement. Holiness resides in function and intent, not in opulence. In some places, especially where poverty persisted, this was a practical convenience, but increasingly it was a theological virtue. The kitchen as sacred space. One of the great shifts of the Reformation was the privatization of devotion. Without the need for priestly intercession or elaborate sacraments, the home became the new center of spiritual life. This was especially true in Protestant households, where the father often led family prayers at meals. The mother's kitchen was considered a moral hearth, where virtue, order, and piety were cultivated. Pottery used in daily cooking began to take on a quiet spiritual weight, not because it was ritually blessed, but because it served a holy purpose, nourishing God's children. Some Lutheran sermons from the mid-1500s even spoke of the stewpot as a tool of Christian charity, reminding the faithful to share their food with neighbors, widows, or the poor. In Calvinist Geneva, a common phrase emerged: "The kettle knows your soul." It meant that one's conduct at home, not just in church, was the true measure of piety. Thus, a pot left clean, food shared generously, and meals taken with gratitude became new forms of spiritual discipline. Iconoclasm and the breaking of sacred vessels. But not all reformist responses to the old church were peaceful. In waves of iconoclasm, violent attacks on religious art and symbols, Protestant mobs destroyed statues, altarpieces, reliquaries, and sacred vessels across parts of Germany, England, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. Among the broken relics were ceramic vessels used for holy water, incense, or anointing oil. These were not spared, even though they were made of simple clay. They had once been set apart for sacred use, and that made them targets. In England, following Henry VII's break from Rome, parishes were instructed to remove popish items. Parish records from the 1540s list: 1 pot of red clay glazed for the washing of holy fingers. 2 basins once used for chrism, now broken and buried. Many of these objects were ritually defaced crosses scraped away, inscriptions burned off in the kiln, or pots shattered and buried under church floorboards. Ironically, in destroying them, reformers only highlighted their former sanctity. The rise of the domestic pottery industry. With religious institutions stripped of much of their wealth and influence, secular domestic life became the main driver of pottery production. In Protestant regions, the ceramic industry flourished, adapting to new aesthetic and functional trends. Pots were no longer made with church standards in mind. Decoration became more personal: floral motifs, proverbs, family crests. Pottery workshops began producing household devotional items: candle holders, plaques with scriptural verses, and pitchers with moral sayings like "waste not," "want not," or "bless this home." These new pots were practical, yes, but they also helped shape a culture where faith and function merged in quiet, persistent ways. This was the beginning of a transformation that would eventually lead to the bourgeois kitchen, a space of both nourishment and morality, framed in clay. The Catholic response: sacred vessels reimagined. Not all of Europe went Protestant. In Catholic strongholds, Spain, Italy, parts of France, and Poland, the Church responded to the Reformation with its own internal reform, known as the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent, 1545–1563, reaffirmed the doctrine of transubstantiation and the importance of ritual objects, but it also encouraged more local craftsmanship, allowed in some cases for ceramic liturgical vessels, especially in missions and frontier churches, promoted the use of modest but dignified materials for rural parishes. As a result, a new generation of sacred pottery emerged, decorated, yes, but reverent. Many bore Marian symbols, local saints, or Latin prayers. In Jesuit missions across South America and Asia, native potters were taught to produce vessels for the Eucharist, baptism, and blessing. These were often made of clay, not gold, and reflected a blending of cultures, part of the Church's global reach. Thus, even within Catholicism, the pot adapted. It remained sacred not by virtue of its substance, but by its use. From sacred to sentimental. By the 17th century, the religious intensity surrounding pots began to wane. Clay returned slowly to its former role, as a quiet servant of daily life. Yet it had been transformed. No longer just a tool for cooking, or even for sacred rites, the pot became a carrier of memory. Family dishes were passed down from mother to daughter. Some pots bore the initials of the household matron. Others were marked with dates, Anno 1623, to commemorate births, marriages, or deaths. In this way, pottery took on a new kind of sacredness, not doctrinal, not institutional, but emotional. It was domestic holiness, the reverence of routine. A cracked pot might still be kept not as a relic of a saint, but of a grandmother. A final shard. As Europe marched toward modernity, with its Enlightenment, revolutions, and industrial advances, the Church's grip on domestic detail faded. Canon law no longer prescribed the washing of pots. Confessors no longer asked what you cooked in them on Fridays. But echoes remained. Even today, in some European villages, clay vessels are used on holy days, filled with food for the poor, or set on church steps as offerings. In others, fragments of medieval pottery unearthed by archaeologists are kept in local museums, labeled with tags like 13th century cooking pot or ecclesiastical shard. They sit, silent and undecorated, waiting. It is easy to walk past them. But if you look closely, you can almost hear the slow bubbling of porridge, the echo of a whispered confession, or the faint chime of a Sanctus bell struck long ago. These were not just pots, they were witnesses. Concluding reflection. In the end, the story of clay and canon law is not about a single doctrine or a forgotten rulebook. It is about how ordinary objects over time become vessels for belief. How the most mundane tools, what we use to cook, to clean, to serve, can absorb the weight of culture, ritual, resistance, and memory. The medieval pot, in all its silence, contained multitudes. It boiled fast-day fish and heretical stews. It held holy water and unspoken sins. It was blessed, cursed, broken, and buried. And as the Church transformed from a medieval monolith to a modern mosaic, so too did the pot. From sacred to domestic, from spiritual to sentimental. Even now we might ask, is there still a trace of sanctity in the tools of daily life? Does the pot on your stove carry history, even if you've never noticed? And if it does, who decides whether that clay is common or holy?